priest lifting a glowing iron inside a small stone church to a line of villagers led through a narrow alpine valley beneath snow-tipped peaks. This is a calm yet haunting journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 hours. We'll begin with why an old church text said the night ride was only an illusion, and move deeper into how storms, vines, and rumor turned the slopes above Lake Geneva into courtrooms. So, put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. The Night Ride. From Canon Episcopi to Church Caution. Picture this. It's sometime around 950 CE, and you're a village priest in what will one day be called Germany. A woman from your parish comes to you, trembling, claiming she's been flying through the night sky with a pagan goddess named Diana, feasting on the flesh of Christians and performing unspeakable rituals. She's convinced it really happened. She can describe every detail: the cold wind beneath her as she soared above the treetops, the taste of forbidden meat, the wild dancing around fires that burned with unnatural colors. What do you tell her? If you're following the guidance laid out in a remarkable church document called the Canon Episcopi, your answer is surprisingly modern. You tell her it was all in her head. The Canon Episcopi, compiled in the 10th century, but claiming much older authority, takes a skeptical stance that would make any rational person today nod in approval. These night flights, these Sabbaths, these gatherings with demons and goddesses, they're illusions, tricks of the mind, diabolic deceptions that feel real but have no substance in the physical world. The canon is quite specific about this. It condemns certain wicked women who believe they ride out at night with the pagan goddess Diana, but it's careful to frame this as a problem of delusion rather than actual supernatural activity. The document states that these women are seduced by the illusions and phantasms of demons, and believe and profess themselves to do these things. The key word here is believe. The canon doesn't suggest they're actually doing anything more dangerous than having very vivid, very disturbing dreams. This was revolutionary thinking for its time, and it set a fascinating precedent. The official position of the Church, at least according to this influential text, was that night-flying witches were essentially suffering from what we might today recognize as a form of sleep disorder or psychological disturbance. The canon even goes so far as to say that anyone who believes such things actually happen is himself falling into heresy, not the supposed witch, but the person who takes the stories literally. But here's where things get complicated, because real life has a way of being messier than official doctrine. While learned clerics in cathedral schools might nod approvingly at the canon's rationalist approach, ordinary people in ordinary villages were dealing with very real problems that seemed to demand supernatural explanations. Crops failed mysteriously, cattle sickened and died, children were born deformed or didn't survive their first winter. Storms struck at precisely the wrong moment, ruining harvests that entire communities depended on. When these disasters struck, people looked for causes, and in a world where scientific understanding of weather patterns, disease, and genetics was essentially non-existent, supernatural causes filled the gap. Someone had to be responsible for the bad luck. And if it wasn't God's will, which good Christians preferred not to assume about every piece of suffering then, perhaps it was the work of someone who had turned against God. This is where the concept of maleficium becomes crucial to our story. Maleficium, literally evil-doing, referred to harmful magic, the use of supernatural forces to cause specific harm to specific people. Unlike the grand, theatrical narratives of night flying and devil worship that the Canon Episcopi dismissed as fantasy, maleficium was immediate, local, and personal. Your cow died after your neighbor muttered something under her breath when you refused to lend her flour. Your baby fell ill after the old woman down the lane gave it an unusually intense look. Your husband's business failed after you had that heated argument with the cunning woman who'd been treating your family's minor ailments for years. The beauty of maleficium accusations from a social perspective, is that they required no elaborate theology or complex demonology. They were simply the supernatural equivalent of assault or vandalism on person deliberately harming another through hidden means. A village court could understand this concept easily, even if they couldn't understand the theological fine points about diabolic illusions and pagan goddesses. So while the Canon Episcopi established an official position of skepticism about the more exotic claims of witchcraft, the flying, the shape-shifting, the elaborate Sabbath ritual sit left plenty of room for belief in simpler forms of harmful magic. This created a kind of two-tier system in medieval thinking about magic. The obviously impossible stuff was dismissed as delusion, but the quietly possible stuff, the curse that kills your livestock, the charm that makes your crops fail, remained a live possibility. This distinction would prove crucial as centuries passed and legal systems became more sophisticated. The framework was already in place. Some magic claims were obviously false, and the people making them were disturbed rather than dangerous. But other magic claims might be real, and the people making them might indeed be criminals. The question that would torment courts for the next 500 years was simple. How do you tell the difference? The Canon Episcopi's approach skepticism about the spectacular, openness about the mundane seems reasonable in hindsight, but it contained the seeds of enormous future problems. By accepting that some magic might be real while dismissing other magic as fantasy, it left judges and juries in the impossible position of having to determine not just whether someone had committed a crime, but whether the crime they'd allegedly committed was even physically possible, as we'll see throughout this long, dark story that proved to be a distinction too subtle for most medieval courts to maintain. Trials by ordeal before 1215. Imagine you're standing in a village square sometime in the year 1200, watching what passes for a criminal trial. There's no jury in the modern sense, no lawyers arguing points of law, no careful examination of evidence. Instead, there's a priest blessing a cauldron of boiling water, a crowd of neighbors holding their breath, and an accused woman rolling up her sleeves as she prepares to plunge her bare hand into water hot enough to cook meat. This is trial by ordeal, and for most of the medieval period, it was how communities determined guilt or innocence when human judgment seemed insufficient. The logic was elegantly simple. God knows the truth, humans don't, so let God decide. If the woman's hand heals cleanly after being scalded, she's innocent. If it festers and corrupts, she's guilty. The Almighty has spoken through her flesh. The ordeal of hot water was just one option in a surprisingly varied menu of divine truth tests. There was the ordeal of hot iron, where the accused had to carry a red-hot piece of metal for a specified distance, usually 9 steps, and then have their burns examined 3 days later. There was the ordeal of cold water, where the accused was bound and lowered into a pond or river. If they floated, the pure water was rejecting them as impure. But if they sank, their innocence was proven, assuming someone pulled them out before they drowned. For the upper classes, there was trial by combat, which operated on the same theological principle but with more style. If you could afford to hire a champion or fight for yourself, you could literally battle for your innocence, confident that God would strengthen the arm of the righteous. It's worth noting that this wasn't quite as insane as it sounds. Professional champions were skilled fighters who won far more often than they lost, which meant that wealthy people who could afford good representation had excellent survival rates. The system was biased, but it was predictably biased, which made it feel fair to the people who designed it. What made ordeals so compelling to medieval communities wasn't just their theological logic, but their psychological impact. These weren't casual procedures, they were elaborate rituals surrounded by prayer, fasting, and ceremony. The accused person would typically spend 3 days in preparation, often in the church itself, eating only bread and water and submitting to intensive spiritual counseling. The priest would bless the instruments of ordeal, invoke divine protection, and create an atmosphere of sacred gravity that impressed everyone present. This ritual solemnity served several purposes. It gave the accused time to confess if they were actually guilty, saving everyone the trouble and expense of the ordeal itself. It demonstrated to the community that justice was being pursued with appropriate seriousness, and it created a psychological environment where unexpected outcomes like someone's hand healing unusually quickly, or floating when they should have sunk felt genuinely miraculous, rather than simply lucky. The ordeal system also had built-in safeguards that made it less arbitrary than it might appear. Priests could refuse to perform ordeals if they had doubts about a case, effectively serving as a check on community hysteria. The procedures had to be followed exactly, which meant that accusations had to be serious enough to justify the expense and ceremony. And there were multiple opportunities for resolution before the ordeal itself: confession, compurgation by oath helpers, or compensation agreements that satisfied the injured parties. Most importantly, ordeals were relatively rare. They were used primarily for serious crimes, where the evidence was ambiguous and the stakes were high. A typical village might see 1 or 2 ordeals per year at most, and many villages went years without any. They were the medieval equivalent of a high-profile trial, unusual, expensive, and memorable. For accusations of harmful magic, ordeals created an interesting dynamic. Unlike theft or assault, where physical evidence might exist, maleficium was inherently invisible. You couldn't prove that someone had cursed your cow or blighted your crops through normal investigative methods. This made magical accusations particularly dependent on reputation, rumor, and communal judgment. Exactly the kind of ambiguous situation where ordeal seemed most appropriate. But ordeals also imposed limits on magical accusations. The ritual seriousness of the process meant that frivolous charges were less likely to proceed to trial. The expense and social disruption meant that communities had incentives to resolve magical disputes through other means: compensation, public penance, or simple avoidance. And the binary nature of ordeal outcomes, guilty or innocent, no middle ground, meant that accusers had to be confident enough in their charges to risk public embarrassment if the accused was vindicated. The psychology of ordeals also worked against the kind of snowballing panic that would characterize later witch hunts. Each ordeal was a separate event with a definitive outcome. If someone survived their ordeal and was declared innocent, that was the end of the matter. There was no appeal process, no way to retry them on the same charges, no mechanism for accusations to multiply and spread. The system was designed to provide closure rather than to generate more questions. This created a surprisingly stable framework for dealing with magical accusations. Communities had a way to resolve disputes that felt both fair and final. Priests had a role that balanced their spiritual authority with practical limitations, and accused individuals had a fighting chance of vindication if they were actually innocent. It wasn't a perfect system. People certainly died in ordeals, both from the procedures themselves and from the punishments that followed guilty verdicts, but it was a predictable system, and predictability is often more important than perfection when it comes to maintaining social order. Of course, this entire framework was about to be swept away by developments that few people in 1200 could have anticipated. The Fourth Lateran Council was only 15 years in the future, and with it would come changes that would fundamentally alter how medieval society approached questions of truth, evidence, and divine judgment. The age of ordeals was ending, but what would replace it was still being born. Lateran IV 1215, and the end of ordeals. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 might not sound like the kind of event that would reshape criminal justice across all of Europe, but sometimes the most momentous changes come wrapped in the most bureaucratic language. Buried among 70 canons dealing with everything from clerical celibacy to the proper way to consecrate communion, wine was a brief prohibition that would revolutionize how medieval courts determined guilt and innocence. Clergy were forbidden from participating in trials by ordeal. This wasn't presented as a dramatic break with tradition. The council's language was typically measured and technical, focusing on the unseemly nature of priests involving themselves in procedures that might result in bloodshed. But the practical effect was immediate and devastating to the ordeal system. Without priestly blessing and supervision, ordeals lost their theological legitimacy. How could you trust God to reveal truth through scalding water if his own representatives refused to sanctify the process? The timing of this prohibition wasn't accidental. By 1215, the intellectual culture of medieval Europe was changing rapidly. The rediscovery of Roman law through contact with Byzantine and Islamic scholars had introduced sophisticated concepts of evidence, procedure, and rational inquiry. Universities were producing graduates trained in logical analysis rather than just scriptural interpretation. The growth of trade and urban life was creating more complex disputes that required more nuanced solutions than guilty or innocent. Canon law itself was becoming more systematic and scholarly. The great legal collections of Gratian and his successors were creating frameworks for canonical procedure that emphasized careful investigation, witness testimony, and documentary evidence. It was becoming increasingly difficult to justify a system that bypassed human reason in favor of divine intervention, especially when that divine intervention seemed to work inconsistently. But what would replace ordeals? The council didn't provide a ready-made alternative, which left courts across Europe scrambling to develop new procedures. The solution that emerged was borrowed primarily from canon law and refined through decades of experimentation: the inquisitorial system. Unlike the ordeal system, which asked a simple question, "Is this person guilty?" and expected a simple answer from God, the inquisitorial system asked complex questions. What exactly happened? Who saw it? What evidence exists? What do witnesses say? How credible are they? The goals shifted from divine revelation to human investigation. This transformation had profound implications for magical accusations. Under the ordeal system, a charge of maleficium was relatively straightforward. The accused either survived their ordeal or they didn't. Under the inquisitorial system, courts had to grapple with much more difficult questions. How do you prove that someone cast a spell? What constitutes evidence of supernatural harm? How do you evaluate testimony about events that, by definition, cannot be observed directly? The new procedures also changed who was involved in magical cases. Ordeals had been community events, with neighbors gathering to witness God's judgment. Inquisitorial procedures were more professional, relying on trained judges, notaries to record testimony, and formal rules of evidence. This professionalization had the advantage of reducing the influence of local prejudices and mob dynamics, but it also meant that decisions were increasingly made by people who might not understand the specific social contexts that generated magical accusations. The rise of written procedure was particularly significant. Under the ordeal system, there had been little need for detailed records. The outcome spoke for itself. But inquisitorial courts generated mountains of paperwork, witness depositions, expert consultations, procedural motions, appeals. This created a paper trail that allowed legal precedents to develop and spread. But it also meant that stereotypical elements of magical accusations could be codified and repeated from case to case. The new system also introduced the concept of incomplete proof evidence that was suggestive but not conclusive. This was a reasonable innovation for ordinary crimes, where partial evidence could guide investigations and plea negotiations. But for magical accusations, incomplete proof created a dangerous gray area. If you couldn't prove someone was a witch through normal evidence, but you couldn't dismiss the charges entirely, what were you supposed to do with them? This problem was compounded by the growing influence of learned demonology on legal thinking. As university-trained judges encountered cases involving magical accusations, they increasingly turned to theological and philosophical authorities for guidance. This meant that local folklore about harmful magic was being filtered through sophisticated theories about diabolic contracts, demonic powers, and heretical beliefs. The result was a gradual escalation in the theoretical seriousness of magical accusations. Under the ordeal system, maleficium had been treated primarily as a form of assault serious, but comprehensible within normal frameworks of crime and punishment. Under the inquisitorial system, maleficium was increasingly understood as a symptom of much more serious spiritual crimes: heresy, apostasy, devil worship. This escalation was neither immediate nor universal. Many courts continued to treat magical accusations as relatively minor matters, imposing modest penalties and focusing on community reconciliation rather than exemplary punishment. But the intellectual framework was shifting in ways that would have enormous consequences over the next several centuries. The abandonment of ordeals also eliminated one of the most important safety valves in the medieval justice system: the possibility of definitive acquittal. Someone who survived an ordeal was unquestionably innocent in the eyes of their community. But someone who was investigated under inquisitorial procedures and released for lack of evidence remained under a cloud of suspicion. They might be innocent, but they also might simply be clever enough to hide their guilt. This ambiguity would prove particularly toxic for magical accusations, which were inherently difficult to disprove. How do you demonstrate that you didn't curse someone's crops or hex their livestock? The ordeal system had provided a clear mechanism for such demonstrations, but the inquisitorial system offered only the unsatisfying conclusion that the evidence was insufficient for conviction. By 1250, the transformation was largely complete. Across most of Europe, courts were using investigative procedures, written records, and rational standards of evidence to determine guilt and innocence. It was a more sophisticated system in many ways, and probably a more accurate one. But it was also a system that was far more vulnerable to the kind of cascading accusations and theoretical elaborations that would characterize the great witch hunts of later centuries. The end of ordeals was progress, but it was progress that came with a price. Ad extirpanda, 1252. Torture enters procedure. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV issued a papal bull with the innocuous title Ad extirpanda, literally, for exterminating. The document was ostensibly about combating heresy, particularly the Cathar movement in southern France. But buried within its administrative language was an authorization that would transform criminal procedure across Europe: the use of torture to extract confessions from suspected heretics. The papal logic was straightforward enough. Heretics were enemies of God and society who threatened the salvation of Christian souls. Their crimes were so serious and their methods so secretive that extraordinary measures were justified to uncover the truth. If gentle questioning and normal legal procedures were insufficient to make them confess, then more persuasive methods were not just permissible but necessary. Innocent IV was careful to hedge his authorization with restrictions. Torture was only to be used once per suspect, though creative lawyers would later argue that each session counted separately, allowing for multiple applications. It was not to cause permanent injury or death, though the definition of permanent proved remarkably flexible, and it was only to be used when there was already strong evidence of guilt, though the standards for strong evidence became increasingly loose over time. The bull also specified that torture could only be administered by secular authorities, not by clergy directly. This maintained the Church's theoretical separation from bloodshed, while ensuring that the Church's enemies could still be systematically broken. It was a masterpiece of ecclesiastical diplomacy, moral authority without moral responsibility. At first, ad extirpanda applied only to heresy cases, and magical accusations were still generally handled as matters of maleficium, harmful sorcery that was criminal but not necessarily heretical. But legal boundaries are porous things, and the techniques authorized for heretics had a way of spreading to other categories of suspects. If torture was acceptable for uncovering secret gatherings of Cathars, why not for uncovering secret gatherings of devil worshippers? If it was justified for exposing networks of religious conspirators, why not for exposing networks of magical conspirators? The torture methods themselves were surprisingly standardized across different jurisdictions, suggesting either a common source of instruction or a grim process of experimentation and refinement. The strappado was probably the most common. The suspects' hands were tied behind their back and attached to a rope that ran over a pulley, allowing them to be hoisted into the air and dropped suddenly, dislocating shoulders and causing excruciating pain, without leaving obvious external marks. The rack stretched suspects horizontally, gradually extending their limbs until joints separated and muscles tore. Sleep deprivation kept suspects awake for days at a time, breaking down their psychological resistance without causing immediate physical damage. Water torture involved forcing large quantities of liquid down the suspect's throat, creating the sensation of drowning without the reality of death. Each method had its advocates and its practical advantages. The strappado was quick and efficient, suitable for extracting specific admissions. The rack allowed for graduated pressure, useful for suspects who seemed to be holding back information. Sleep deprivation was less dramatic, but often more effective for complex cases requiring detailed confessions. Water torture was psychologically devastating and left few permanent marks. What made torture particularly dangerous in magical cases was the nature of the confessions it produced. Unlike theft or assault, where physical evidence could corroborate or contradict what suspects said under torture, magical crimes existed primarily in the realm of belief and testimony. If someone confessed under torture to meeting with devils or flying to Sabbath gatherings, how could investigators verify these claims? The confession itself became the primary evidence, creating a circular logic that was almost impossible to escape. The legal concept of half-proof played a crucial role in this dynamic. Under medieval legal theory, certain types of evidence like the testimony of a single witness or circumstantial connections between suspects and alleged crimes constituted half-proof, which wasn't sufficient for conviction, but was sufficient to justify torture. In magical cases, half-proof was remarkably easy to establish. Unusual deaths among livestock, reports of strange lights or sounds, testimony from neighbors about suspicious behavior, even the mere reputation for knowledge of herbs or charms. Once torture was authorized, the threshold for conviction dropped dramatically. Suspects who might have successfully challenged accusations under the old ordeal system, or who might have escaped conviction under purely investigative procedures, found themselves facing irresistible physical pressure to confess to whatever their interrogators wanted to hear. The confession culture that developed around torture also created powerful incentives for suspects to implicate others. Interrogators weren't just interested in individual guilt. They wanted to understand networks, conspiracies, and broader patterns of magical activity. Suspects, who provided names of accomplices or details about group activities, often received more lenient treatment than those who maintained their innocence or claimed to have acted alone. This dynamic was particularly pronounced in magical cases because the emerging demonological theory emphasized that witches operated in groups. Unlike simple maleficium, which could be performed by individuals, the new model of devil worship implied organized covens, regular meetings, and shared rituals. Interrogators expected to hear about multiple participants, and suspects learned to provide them. The geographical spread of torture techniques was facilitated by the growing professionalization of legal systems. Trained judges moved between jurisdictions, carrying procedural knowledge with them. Legal handbooks circulated among courts, standardizing approaches to different types of cases. University law faculties developed theoretical frameworks that justified and regulated the use of coercive questioning. But perhaps most importantly, torture worked at least from the perspective of the authorities who employed it. It generated confessions, it produced detailed narratives that satisfied contemporary expectations about magical crimes, and it demonstrated decisive action against perceived threats to social order. The fact that these confessions were extracted under conditions that made them inherently unreliable was a subtlety that most medieval legal systems were not equipped to address. The authorization of torture in Ad Extirpanda represents a crucial turning point in our story. Combined with the collapse of the ordeal system and the rise of inquisitorial procedures, it created the legal toolkit that would make large-scale witch hunts possible. The techniques were now available, the procedures were becoming standardized, and the theoretical framework was expanding to accommodate ever more elaborate accusations. All that was needed was the right combination of social pressure, legal opportunity, and ideological conviction to put these tools to their most devastating use. The tension between magic and medicine. In the autumn of 1347, a woman named Margot lived in a small village outside what is now Strasbourg. She knew which herbs eased the pain of childbirth, which poultices drew infection from wounds, and which teas could bring down a dangerous fever. When the baker's wife went into difficult labor, they called for Margot. When the miller's son broke his arm, they called for Margot. When the harvest was poor and people worried about surviving the winter, they came to Margot for advice about preserving food and rationing grain. Margot was what medieval people called a cunning woman, someone with practical knowledge of healing, helpful magic, and community medicine. Every village had someone like her, usually an older woman who had accumulated decades of experience with births, deaths, illnesses, and the endless small crises of rural life. These women were essential figures in their communities, filling gaps that formal medicine and official religion couldn't address. But here's the thing about being essential. It also makes you vulnerable. The same knowledge that made Margot indispensable when things went well made her dangerous when things went badly. If her herbal remedies saved lives, couldn't they also take lives? If she knew how to help crops grow, didn't she also know how to make them fail? If her charms could protect livestock from disease, couldn't they also curse healthy animals with sickness? This was the fundamental tension that made cunning folk such frequent targets of magical accusations. Their very competence in beneficial magic made accusations of harmful magic plausible. After all, the theoretical framework was identical. Both good and bad magic involved manipulating supernatural forces to achieve specific results. The only difference was intention, and intention is notoriously difficult to prove in a court of law. The situation was complicated by the economic realities of cunning work. These were not wealthy people dispensing charity from positions of security. Margot and others like her charged for their services, negotiated payment schedules, and sometimes had to deal with clients who couldn't or wouldn't pay what they owed. This created natural points of conflict that could easily escalate into accusations of supernatural revenge. Imagine Margot treats the blacksmith's infected hand, charging a fee of 6 silver coins. The treatment works, the infection clears, and the blacksmith's livelihood is saved. But suppose he pays only 4 coins, claiming he can't afford the full amount, and promises to pay the rest later. Months pass, the debt remains unpaid, and the blacksmith seems to be prospering while Margot struggles to buy food for the coming winter. Then the blacksmith's horse dies suddenly, or his forge fire keeps going out at inconvenient times, or his children develop a persistent cough that won't respond to normal treatments. In a world where people believe in magical cause and effect, it's natural for the blacksmith to wonder whether Margot might have decided to collect her debt through supernatural means. And once that suspicion takes root, Every subsequent misfortune becomes potential evidence of ongoing magical harassment. The ambiguity of cunning work extended beyond economics to the practices themselves. Medieval herbalism was an odd mixture of practical medicine, folk magic, and religious ritual. A remedy for stomach ailments might combine genuinely effective herbs with mystical incantations and appeals to patron saints. A charm for protecting livestock might include both rational husbandry advice and elaborate supernatural prescriptions. This mixing of natural and supernatural elements made it difficult for outside observers to distinguish between legitimate medicine and suspicious magic. When Margot gathered herbs at dawn while muttering Latin phrases, was she maximizing the medicinal potency of her plants through optimal timing, or was she performing some kind of occult ritual? When she insisted that certain remedies would only work if the patient followed specific behavioral restrictions, was she ensuring compliance with medical treatment, or was she imposing magical conditions? The problem was compounded by the fact that medieval medicine, even at its most learned and official levels, incorporated elements that we would now consider magical. University-trained physicians routinely consulted astrological charts when diagnosing illnesses and timing treatments. Monastic healers combined herbal medicine with prayer, blessing, and the invocation of saints. Even the most respectable medical practices involved theories about bodily humors, planetary influences, and spiritual factors that were essentially supernatural in nature. This meant that the line between legitimate healing and suspicious magic was not just blurry, it was constantly shifting depending on who was doing the judging. A remedy that seemed perfectly reasonable when performed by a male university graduate might seem dangerously magical when performed by an illiterate village woman. The same combination of herbs, incantations, and ritual procedures could be classified as medicine or magic, depending on the social status and formal training of the practitioner. Gender played a crucial role in these distinctions. Medieval medical theory held that women were naturally more connected to the material world and less capable of the abstract reasoning that characterized learned medicine. This made them suitable for practical healing work, midwifery, herb gathering, the care of minor ailments, but it also made them suspect when their practices became too successful or too elaborate. The fact that cunning women often specialized in reproductive medicine made them particularly vulnerable to accusations of harmful magic. Pregnancy, childbirth, and infant care were areas where outcomes were unpredictable and where strong emotions were always involved. A midwife who successfully delivered healthy babies was a community treasure, but a midwife who presided over stillbirths or maternal deaths quickly became a figure of suspicion. The demographic realities of medieval life exacerbated these tensions. High infant mortality rates meant that even the most skilled midwives lost babies regularly. Complications during childbirth were common and often fatal. Postpartum infections killed mothers who had survived the delivery itself. In a world where people expected supernatural explanations for unexpected deaths, the statistical reality of obstetric medicine made accusations almost inevitable. Community dependence on cunning folk also created its own psychological pressures. Villages that relied heavily on a particular healer often developed ambivalent feelings about that dependence. Margot's neighbors needed her services, but they also resented their need. They were grateful for her help, but they were also afraid of her power. They respected her knowledge, but they were also suspicious of how she had acquired it. This ambivalence could remain dormant for years or even decades, only surfacing during periods of particular stress or misfortune. A harsh winter, a failed harvest, or an outbreak of disease could suddenly transform a respected healer into a convenient scapegoat. The very expertise that had made her valuable to the community became evidence of her dangerous capabilities. As legal systems became more sophisticated and torture became more common, these long-standing social tensions found new outlets through formal accusation and trial. The rise of inquisitorial procedure meant that rumor and suspicion could be systematically investigated and documented. The availability of coercive questioning meant that accused cunning folk could be pressured to confess not just to harmful magic, but to elaborate networks of diabolic conspiracy. The stage was being set for a collision between traditional healing practices and an evolving legal system that was increasingly suspicious of any activities that couldn't be easily categorized and controlled. Sorcery as heresy. John 26, John 23, Bulls, 1317, 1326. Pope John the 22 was not a man who believed in half measures. When he decided that magical practices posed a serious threat to Christian society, he didn't issue gentle pastoral warnings or vague theological guidance. Instead, between 1317 and 1326, he produced a series of papal bulls that fundamentally redefined sorcery from a criminal matter into a heretical 1EA shift that would have catastrophic consequences for anyone accused of magical practices over the next 3 centuries. The transformation began with Spondent quas non exhibent in 1317, which condemned practitioners of ritual magic who promised results they couldn't deliver. This might sound like simple consumer protection preventing magical charlatans from defrauding their customers. But John the 22's language went much deeper. He wasn't just concerned with fraud, he was concerned with the theological implications of magical practice itself. According to the Pope's analysis, anyone who claimed to work magic was necessarily making one of 2 assertions. Either they could command supernatural forces through their own power, which implied a blasphemous claim to divine authority, or they were receiving assistance from demons, which implied apostasy and devil worship. There was no middle ground, no category for harmless folk magic or beneficial healing practices. All magic was either divine presumption or diabolic collaboration. This binary framework had enormous legal implications. Under the old system, magical accusations had been primarily about maleficium-specific harmful acts that damaged specific people. Proving maleficium required demonstrating that the accused person had actually caused particular injuries through supernatural means. It was often difficult to prove, which provided a natural check on accusations. But heresy was different. Heresy was about beliefs, intentions, and spiritual states rather than specific criminal acts. You could be guilty of heretical thinking even if you hadn't actually harmed anyone. You could be condemned for holding dangerous opinions, performing suspicious rituals, or associating with questionable people. The focus shifted from, "What did you do?" to, "What do you believe?" and, "Who are you really serving?" John 2012's subsequent bulls expanded this framework systematically. Super Ilias Specula in 1326 specifically addressed practitioners of learned magic university, educated men who used elaborate rituals, ancient texts, and sophisticated theoretical frameworks to accomplish supernatural goals. These weren't village-wise women casting love charms. These were scholars and clerics who had access to the most advanced magical literature of their time. The Pope's concern with learned magic reflected a genuine problem within educated circles. Medieval universities had preserved and transmitted classical texts on astronomy, alchemy, and natural philosophy that contained detailed instructions for magical practices. Students could learn how to construct astrological talismans, how to summon spiritual entities, and how to manipulate natural forces through ritual procedures. Some of this material came from Islamic sources, which made it doubly suspicious to Christian authorities. What worried John the 22 was not just that learned men were practicing magic, but that they were developing sophisticated theological justifications for doing so. They argued that their practices were natural philosophy rather than sorcery, that they were investigating God's creation rather than worshipping demons. that their rituals were scientific experiments rather than religious observances. This intellectual sophistication made them more dangerous than simple village sorcerers because they could convince others that their activities were legitimate. The papal response was to collapse all these distinctions. According to John 1:32's bulls, it didn't matter whether magical practitioners were learned or ignorant, whether their intentions were good or evil, whether their methods were sophisticated or crude. What mattered was that they were attempting to manipulate supernatural forces outside the proper channels of Christian prayer and sacrament. This was inherently heretical because it implied either that God's power could be commanded by human techniques, or that other spiritual entities were worthy of invocation and respect. The legal machinery for prosecuting heresy was already well developed by the early 14th century. The Papal Inquisition had been established in the previous century to combat Cathar and Waldensian movements, and it had evolved efficient procedures for identifying, investigating, and punishing heretical beliefs. Inquisitors were trained in theology and canon law. They had access to papal authorization for torture, and they could impose punishments ranging from penance and fines to imprisonment and execution. By redefining sorcery as heresy, John the 2012's bulls made this entire apparatus available for magical cases. An accusation of sorcery was no longer just a local criminal matter to be handled by village courts or secular magistrates. It was now a matter of faith and doctrine that required specialized expertise and could justify the most extreme measures. The theological framework also created new categories of evidence that courts could consider. Under the old maleficium system, you needed to prove specific harmful acts, dead livestock, failed crops, unexplained illnesses. Under the heresy system, you could prove guilt through evidence of magical learning, possession of suspicious books, participation in ritual activities, or even just association with known practitioners. This expansion of relevant evidence made accusations much easier to sustain. If someone owned a copy of an astrological text, that could be evidence of heretical study. If they had been seen gathering herbs at unusual times, that could be evidence of ritual practice. If they had unusual knowledge of medicine or natural philosophy, that could be evidence of diabolic instruction. The net of suspicion could be cast much wider because the standards of proof had become much more flexible. The bulls also introduced the crucial concept of the diabolic pact, the idea that magical practitioners had entered into formal agreements with demons in exchange for supernatural power. This wasn't just a theological speculation. It became a legal fact that courts were expected to investigate and document. Suspects could be tortured to reveal the terms of their pacts, the names of the demons they served, and the rituals they had performed to seal their agreements. The pact theory transformed the psychology of magical accusations in fundamental ways. It was no longer enough to accuse someone of causing specific harm through supernatural means. Now you were accusing them of apostasy, of deliberately choosing evil over good, of betraying their Christian faith in favor of diabolic service. The emotional and social stakes were vastly higher, which made accusations more devastating but also more compelling to communities looking for explanations for their misfortunes. John 2012's redefinition of sorcery also created new opportunities for political manipulation. Because heresy was such a serious charge, and because magical accusations were now automatically heretical, enemies could use sorcery charges to destroy rivals who might be difficult to attack through normal means. This was particularly useful in court politics, where accusations of magical practice could be leveled against advisors, nobles, or even rival claimants to thrones. The papal bulls didn't immediately trigger massive witch hunts that development would come later, when the theological framework established by John the 22, combined with specific social and political pressures in particular regions, but they established the essential conceptual foundation that made later persecutions possible. By 1326, sorcery was officially heresy. Heresy was officially a capital crime, and the legal machinery for systematic persecution was officially available to anyone with sufficient authority and determination to use it. The transformation was complete. What had once been a matter of harmful magic between neighbors was now a matter of cosmic warfare between God and Satan, with human souls as the battleground. Demonological blueprints before the MALLEUS. Long before Heinrich Kramer sat down to write the infamous Malleus Maleficarum in the 1480s, medieval intellectuals were already constructing elaborate theoretical frameworks for understanding magical practices and their relationship to diabolic power. These early demonological treatises, written primarily by theologians and inquisitors, established the conceptual vocabulary that would shape witch trials for centuries to come. One of the most influential early systematizers was Bernard Gui, a Dominican inquisitor active in southern France during the early 14th century. Gui's Practica Inquisitionis Heretice Pravitatis, written around 1323, was ostensibly a practical manual for identifying and prosecuting heretics, but it contained detailed sections on magical practices that would become standard reference material for later courts. Gui was particularly interested in what he called invokers of demons, practitioners of learned magic, who used elaborate rituals to summon spiritual entities and compel them to provide information or services. According to his analysis, these practices were inherently heretical because they involved worship of demons, whether the practitioners realized it or not. Even if magicians believed they were commanding demons rather than worshipping them, Gui argued that the act of invocation itself constituted a form of religious observance that violated the first commandment. This theological sophistication was crucial to the development of later witch-hunting ideology. Earlier treatments of magic had focused primarily on harmful effects, the maleficium that damaged crops, killed livestock, or injured people. Gui and his contemporaries were more interested in the spiritual mechanics of magical practice. How did magic actually work? What was the relationship between human practitioners and supernatural forces? What did magical practice reveal about the practitioner's fundamental spiritual orientation? The answers they developed were both complex and terrifying. According to emerging demonological theory, demons were fallen angels who retained much of their original supernatural power, but who were now devoted to corrupting human souls and opposing God's will. These beings were intelligent, sophisticated, and patient. They didn't simply tempt humans into individual sins. They developed long-term strategies for turning people away from salvation. Magic was one of their primary tools in this campaign. By teaching humans how to manipulate supernatural forces, demons could gradually draw people into deeper and deeper forms of spiritual corruption. Someone might begin with simple divination or healing practices, but the demons would slowly escalate their demands, requiring more elaborate rituals, more explicit acknowledgments of demonic power, and eventually formal pacts that committed the practitioner's soul to diabolic service. This escalation model had enormous implications for how courts understood magical accusations. It suggested that even seemingly innocent practice using herbs to heal illness, reading palms to predict the future, casting love charms to attract romantic partners, were potentially the first steps in a process that would inevitably lead to devil worship and apostasy. There was no such thing as harmless magic, because all magic was ultimately demonic in origin. The theoretical framework also provided explanations for some of the more exotic claims that were beginning to appear in magical accusations. If demons were powerful spiritual beings who could manipulate physical reality, then stories about night flying, shape-shifting, and attendance at diabolic gatherings became theoretically plausible. These weren't necessarily delusions or lies. They might be accurate descriptions of experiences that demons had provided to their human servants. Johannes Nieder, a Dominican theologian writing in the 1430s, took these ideas even further in his Formicarius. Nieder had access to trial records from the early Alpine witch hunts, and he used this material to construct what amounted to an ethnography of diabolic worship. According to his account, witches gathered regularly in remote locations where they performed ceremonies that inverted and mocked Christian rituals. They worshipped a demon who appeared in various forms. They engaged in orgies and cannibalism. They learned techniques for weather magic and maleficium, and they recruited new members through a combination of seduction and coercion. This Sabbath mythology would become one of the most persistent and destructive elements of later witch-hunting ideology. It provided a framework for understanding magical practice as an organized conspiracy rather than a collection of individual crimes. If witches were meeting regularly to share techniques and coordinate their attacks on Christian society, then individual accusations were just the visible tip of a much larger iceberg of hidden diabolic activity. The conspiracy framework also justified more aggressive investigative techniques. If accused witches were part of organized groups, then interrogators were obligated to uncover the full extent of the network. This meant that torture wasn't just about confirming individual guilt. It was about mapping diabolic organizations and identifying all their members. Every confession was potentially the beginning of a larger investigation rather than the end of a particular case. Regional variation in these early demonological theories reflected different sources of anxiety and different legal traditions. In Alpine regions, where communities were isolated and dependent on agriculture, the focus was primarily on weather magic and its effects on crops and livestock. In university towns, where learned magic was more common, the emphasis was on ritual practices and their theological implications. In areas with strong inquisitorial traditions, the framework was more systematic and procedurally sophisticated. But despite these regional differences, certain core ideas were becoming standardized across different jurisdictions. The concept of the diabolic pact was virtually universal in learned treatments of magic by the mid-15th century. The idea that demons could provide real supernatural power to their human servants was widely accepted. The notion that magical practices constituted heresy rather than simple criminal behavior was increasingly dominant in theological and legal circles. These theoretical developments created a kind of intellectual infrastructure that made large-scale witch hunts conceptually possible. Earlier periods had lacked the explanatory frameworks necessary to understand magical accusations as anything more than isolated disputes between neighbors. But by the middle of the 15th century, European intellectuals had constructed elaborate theories that could account for complex patterns of accusation, provide justifications for intensive investigation, and explain why magical crimes deserved the most severe punishments. The blueprints were complete. All that was needed was the right combination of social pressure and legal opportunity to put them into practice. In some regions, particularly the Alpine valleys of Switzerland and France, those conditions were already beginning to emerge. The first systematic witch hunts were still decades away, but the intellectual foundations that would make them possible were already firmly in place. What's particularly striking about these early demonological works is their combination of theoretical sophistication and practical application. These weren't just abstract theological speculations, they were working documents used by active prosecutors to guide real investigations and justify real punishments. The marriage of scholarly theory and legal practice would prove to be one of the most dangerous developments in the entire history of European witch hunting. Women, gender, and suspicion. The statistics are stark and undeniable. Across medieval Europe, magical accusations targeted women at rates far exceeding what random chance would predict. In some regions and time periods, women comprised up to 80% of those accused of sorcery, a disproportion so extreme that it demands explanation. Yet the reality of medieval witch accusations was more complex than simple misogyny, involving intricate intersections of gender, age, social status, and economic vulnerability that varied significantly across different communities and legal systems. To understand why women were disproportionately accused of magical crimes, we need to examine the specific social positions that medieval women occupied and how those positions made them both valuable and vulnerable to their communities. Women's work in medieval society was largely centered around what we might call the management of life's margins: birth, death, illness, and the countless small crises that threatened household stability and survival. Midwifery was perhaps the most critical and most dangerous of these roles. Every village needed women who understood the mechanics of childbirth, who could assist with difficult deliveries, and who knew how to care for mothers and infants during the precarious weeks following birth. These women possessed specialized knowledge that was literally a matter of life and death, and their success or failure had immediate, visible consequences for the families they served. The problem was that medieval obstetrics was a high-risk profession with limited technological resources. Even the most skilled midwife would lose babies and mothers regularly, not through incompetence, but because of the biological realities of pregnancy and childbirth in an era without antibiotics, blood transfusions, or surgical interventions. When these deaths occurred, grieving families naturally looked for explanations, and the midwife who had been present became an obvious target for blame. The situation was complicated by the spiritual significance that medieval Christianity attached to childbirth and infant mortality. Babies who died before baptism faced uncertain spiritual fates, which gave their deaths a cosmic significance that went far beyond personal grief. If a midwife's patients experienced unusually high rates of infant mortality, it wasn't just a professional failure, it was potentially evidence of diabolic intervention in the salvation of souls. Herbalism and healing presented similar risks. Medieval women were expected to possess practical knowledge of plants, remedies, and home medicine. They treated minor injuries, prepared medicines for common ailments, and provided health care for family members and neighbors who couldn't afford more formal medical attention. This knowledge was valuable and necessary, but it also created opportunities for suspicion when treatments failed or when patients experienced unexpected complications. The gendered nature of medical knowledge also reflected broader medieval assumptions about women's relationship to the natural world. Theological and philosophical traditions held that women were more closely connected to material reality and less capable of abstract reasoning than men. This made them suitable for practical healing work, which required familiarity with plants, bodies, and natural processes. But it also made their knowledge seem less rational and more potentially supernatural than equivalent expertise possessed by male physicians. Economic factors amplified these vulnerabilities. Many of the women who practiced healing or midwifery were widows or unmarried women who depended on their specialized knowledge for economic survival. They charged fees for their services, negotiated payment arrangements, and sometimes had to deal with clients who were unable or unwilling to pay what they owed. These economic relationships created natural points of conflict that could easily escalate into accusations of magical revenge when clients experienced subsequent misfortunes. The life cycle patterns of accusation reveal additional dimensions of gender vulnerability. Young women were most commonly accused of love magic using supernatural means to attract or manipulate romantic partners. These accusations often emerged from sexual competition or from relationships that had gone badly, and they reflected anxieties about female sexuality and its potential for disrupting social order. Middle-aged women, particularly those between 40 and 60, faced different but equally serious risks. This was the demographic group most likely to be accused of maleficium, harmful magic directed at neighbors, livestock, or crops. These women had often accumulated decades of community relationships, both positive and negative, and they possessed the practical knowledge that made accusations of supernatural harm plausible. Older women, especially those over 60, were vulnerable to accusations that reflected broader social anxieties about aging, dependence, and social marginality. Post-menopausal women occupied an ambiguous position in medieval society. They were no longer capable of reproduction, which was women's primary social function, but they often possessed decades of accumulated knowledge and experience that made them influential community figures. This combination of social marginality and potential power made elderly women particularly susceptible to scapegoating during periods of community stress. When crops failed, livestock died, or unexplained illnesses struck, communities often focused their suspicions on older women who lacked the social protection that came from having husbands, young children, or substantial economic resources. The reputation systems that governed medieval community life also worked differently for women than for men. Female reputations were more fragile and more closely tied to moral behavior, particularly sexual conduct. A woman who was suspected of adultery, who bore children outside marriage, or who was simply seen as too independent or outspoken, could find her reputation permanently damaged in ways that made her vulnerable to supernatural accusations. Conversely, women who were too successful in their healing or midwifery practices could also attract suspicion. If a midwife had unusually good outcomes, or if an herbalist's remedies seemed unusually effective, community members might wonder whether supernatural assistance was involved. The same competence that made these women valuable also made them potentially dangerous in the eyes of neighbors who couldn't understand how their knowledge worked. It's important to note that men were also accused of magical crimes throughout the medieval period, though in smaller numbers and often under different circumstances. Male magical practitioners were more likely to be accused of learned magic ritual practices that required literacy, expensive materials, and sophisticated theoretical knowledge. These accusations often emerged from political conflicts, court intrigue, or professional rivalries rather than from neighborhood disputes over failed healing or livestock deaths. The gender dynamics of magical accusation also varied significantly by region and legal system. In areas where Roman law traditions remained strong, women had somewhat more legal protection and autonomy, which may have reduced their vulnerability to magical accusations. In regions where customary law prevailed, women's legal status was more dependent on their relationships to male relatives, which could either increase or decrease their exposure to supernatural charges depending on their specific family circumstances. The rise of more systematic legal procedures and the increasing influence of learned demonology would eventually alter these patterns in significant ways. As magical accusations became more closely associated with heresy and devil worship, the gender dynamics shifted somewhat, with more men being drawn into cases that were understood as organized diabolic conspiracies rather than individual instances of harmful magic. Nevertheless, the fundamental vulnerability factors that made medieval women disproportionate targets for magical accusations, their roles as healers and midwives, their economic dependence on community relationships, their marginal legal status, and their association with the management of life's most precarious moments, would continue to shape the demographics of witch hunting throughout the early modern period. The village courtroom, the path from whispered suspicion to formal accusation in medieval magical cases, was neither straight nor predictable. Understanding how rumors crystallized into legal proceedings requires examining the complex social machinery that governed village life, the networks of obligation, authority, and reputation that determined when private grievances became public concerns. In most medieval communities, formal accusations emerged from informal processes that could unfold over months or even years. Magical charges rarely appeared suddenly. Instead, they typically represented the culmination of long-standing disputes, accumulated grievances, and gradually escalating community tensions. The actual courtroom drama was just the final act in stories that had been developing for much longer periods. The initial spark often came from specific misfortunes that seemed to demand supernatural explanations. A previously healthy cow might die overnight with no obvious cause. A field that had been productive for years might suddenly yield poor harvests. A child might develop a mysterious illness that resisted normal remedies. In themselves, these events weren't necessarily suspicious. Medieval life was full of unexplained setbacks and tragedies. But when they occurred in the context of existing social conflicts, they could take on more sinister significance. The transformation from misfortune to suspicion typically required what we might call a story bridge, a narrative that connected the victim's problems to a potential perpetrator's actions. This bridge was usually provided by community members who had observed interactions between the parties, who remembered previous conflicts, or who possessed knowledge about the alleged perpetrator's reputation and capabilities. For example, imagine that goodwife Agnes's chickens die mysteriously one morning. In itself, this is simply bad luck. Chickens die, for all sorts of reasons, from disease to predators to bad feed. But suppose Agnes recalls that 3 days earlier, she had a heated argument with Margot the herbalist about payment for treating Agnes's sick child. During that argument, Margot had muttered something under her breath as she left Agnes's house, and Agnes had noticed that Margot seemed unusually angry about the payment dispute. The story bridge emerges when Agnes shares this sequence of events with neighbors: the argument, the muttered words, the dead chickens. Other community members might contribute additional elements to the narrative. Perhaps someone saw Margot gathering herbs near Agnes's house, or someone remembers previous instances where Margot's customers experienced problems after payment disputes. Gradually, a collective story develops that explains Agnes's misfortune in supernatural terms. This process of collective narrative construction was crucial to medieval magical accusations because it provided the social validation necessary to transform private suspicions into public charges. In small communities where everyone knew everyone else, accusations that lacked community support were unlikely to proceed to formal legal action. But accusations that reflected broader patterns of suspicion or that aligned with existing community anxieties could quickly gain momentum. The role of local officials in this process was complex and often ambiguous. Village reeves, bailiffs, and other minor officials were typically drawn from the community itself, which meant they were embedded in the same social networks that generated magical accusations. They weren't impartial legal professionals. They were neighbors and relatives of both accusers and accused, with their own knowledge of local personalities, conflicts, and histories. This local knowledge could work in different directions. Officials who knew an accused person well might be skeptical of charges that seemed inconsistent with their direct experience. But they might also be aware of patterns of behavior or reputation that made accusations seem more credible. The decision about whether to allow a case to proceed to formal trial often reflected these officials' assessment of community sentiment as much as their evaluation of specific evidence. The mechanics of moving from suspicion to formal accusation varied depending on local legal traditions and the specific nature of the charges. In many regions, magical cases began with a process called presentment, where community representatives formally brought charges to the attention of appropriate authorities. This might happen at regular court sessions held monthly or quarterly, or it might be triggered by specific requests from injured parties. Weather as weapon. Nothing struck terror into the heart of a medieval community quite like unexpected weather. A sudden hailstorm could destroy an entire season's crops in minutes. An unseasonable frost could kill fruit trees that had taken decades to mature. A drought could transform fertile fields into dusty wastelands, while torrential rains could wash away carefully tended plots and drown livestock in their pastures. In an agricultural economy where survival depended on predictable seasonal patterns, weather was literally a matter of life and death. What made weather particularly frightening wasn't just its destructive power, but its apparent arbitrariness. Storms seemed to strike some fields while leaving neighboring plots untouched. Rain might fall abundantly on one side of a valley, while the other side remained parched. Hail could devastate a single farmer's grain, while leaving his neighbor's crop pristine. In a world where people believed in intentional causation behind all significant events, this selectivity demanded explanation. The leap from observation to accusation was often surprisingly direct. If your crops were destroyed by a freak storm while your neighbors remained intact, it was natural to wonder whether supernatural forces might be involved. If that neighbor happened to be someone you'd quarreled with recently, someone with a reputation for unusual knowledge, or someone who belonged to a family long suspected of magical capabilities, the suspicion could quickly crystallize into accusation. Medieval theories about weather magic were both sophisticated and terrifying. According to learned authorities, demons possessed the power to manipulate atmospheric conditions within limits set by divine providence. They couldn't create truly unnatural phenomena as snow in summer or sunshine at midnight, but they could intensify natural weather patterns, redirect existing storms, or create localized disturbances that appeared normal but were actually supernatural in origin. This theoretical framework made weather magic accusations particularly difficult to defend against. Unlike other forms of maleficium, where the accused might argue that alleged victims had died from natural causes or that their misfortunes were coincidental, weather magic seemed to leave physical evidence in the form of damaged crops, dead livestock, and economic devastation. The effects were visible, immediate, and often catastrophic for the families involved. The gender dynamics of weather magic accusations reflected broader patterns in magical prosecutions, but with some interesting variations. While women were still disproportionately accused, weather magic cases often involved more male defendants than other categories of supernatural crime. This may have reflected the fact that weather control was understood to require considerable supernatural power, which some communities associated more with male practitioners than with the healing and household magic typically attributed to women. The social profile of weather magic defendants also differed from other magical accusations. These cases often targeted people who were relatively prosperous and well established in their communities, rather than the marginal figures who dominated other categories of supernatural crime. Someone who could allegedly control weather possessed enormous power over agricultural success and failure, which made them figures of both respect and fear within rural communities. This dynamic created particularly complex community relationships around weather magic accusations. A person suspected of weather control might be simultaneously courted and shunned by neighbors valued for their potential to ensure good harvests, but feared for their capacity to cause agricultural disasters. These ambivalent relationships could persist for years or even decades before crystallizing into formal accusations. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life shaped both the timing and the content of weather magic cases. Accusations often peaked during periods of particular vulnerability: late spring, when crops were sprouting, midsummer, when grain was ripening, and early autumn, when harvest success or failure was being determined. The specific allegations also reflected seasonal concerns. Spring cases might focus on late frosts that killed seedlings, summer cases on droughts or hailstorms that damaged growing crops, and autumn cases on premature rains that spoiled harvests. The economic stakes of weather magic accusations were enormous, both for accusers and accused. A successful harvest might mean the difference between prosperity and starvation for an entire family. The destruction of crops through alleged supernatural means could represent not just a single year's loss, but the collapse of a household's economic foundation. These high stakes made weather magic cases particularly emotional and contentious, with entire communities sometimes dividing along factional lines. The investigative challenges posed by weather magic cases were also distinctive. Unlike accusations of poisoning or cursing, where investigators might look for physical evidence of magical practices, weather magic left only its alleged effects as evidence. Courts had to determine whether particular weather events were natural or supernatural, whether they were directed at specific targets or merely coincidental. and whether alleged perpetrators actually possessed the knowledge and power necessary to control atmospheric conditions. These evidentiary problems were compounded by the fact that weather magic was understood to work at a distance, without requiring direct contact between perpetrator and victim. An accused weather witch didn't need to visit their target's property, handle their crops, or even be seen in the vicinity when damage occurred. The alleged magic could be performed from miles away, which made it virtually impossible to establish alibis or disprove accusations through conventional investigative methods. The theological implications of weather magic also distinguished these cases from other categories of supernatural crime. Because weather was understood to be under divine control, anyone who claimed to manipulate atmospheric conditions was necessarily challenging God's authority over creation. This made weather magic inherently blasphemous in ways that went beyond the heretical implications of other magical practices. The regional variation in weather magic prosecutions reflected both environmental factors and cultural differences. Alpine communities, which were particularly vulnerable to sudden storms and localized weather events, developed elaborate folklore about weather witches and corresponding legal procedures for prosecuting them. Coastal regions worried more about supernatural control over winds and tides. Plains communities focused on drought, magic, and hailstorms. These regional specializations would become crucial as weather magic accusations began to spread beyond individual cases to encompass larger patterns of supernatural conspiracy. The Alpine witch hunts of the 15th century, in particular, would develop elaborate theories about organized groups of weather witches who gathered regularly to coordinate attacks on agricultural communities across entire valleys and mountain ranges. The village-level weather magic cases of the earlier medieval period thus provided both the conceptual framework and the procedural precedents that would make large-scale weather magic persecutions possible. Communities had already established that supernatural weather control was theoretically possible, legally prosecutable, and socially devastating. All that was needed was the right combination of environmental stress, social tension, and legal innovation to transform isolated accusations into systematic campaigns of persecution. The stage was set for the great Alpine witch hunts, where weather magic would become not just an individual crime, but a collective conspiracy that threatened the survival of entire regions. The Stedinger affair, 1230s, Lower Saxony. In the marshy lowlands of Lower Saxony, where the Weser River spreads into countless channels before reaching the North Sea, lived a community of peasants who had carved prosperity from some of the most challenging terrain in medieval Europe. The Stedingers, as they came to be known, were reclamation specialists farmers who had drained swamps, built dikes, and transformed waterlogged wilderness into productive agricultural land through generations of back-breaking labor. By the 1220s, the Stedinger communities had become something unusual in medieval Europe, prosperous peasant republics that governed themselves through elected councils and resisted the feudal obligations that bound most rural populations to noble overlords. They paid taxes directly to the Holy Roman Emperor rather than serving local lords. They controlled their own courts and military organizations, and they had developed a fierce independence that made them increasingly problematic for the regional nobility who coveted their wealth and strategic location. The transformation of this political conflict into a religious crusade began with accusations that seem almost quaint compared to the elaborate demonological theories that would emerge in later centuries. The Stedingers were charged with refusing to pay church tithes, with treating clergy disrespectfully, and with practicing superstitious rituals that allegedly involved the worship of a demonic toad and participation in orgies that mocked Christian sacraments. These accusations followed a familiar pattern from earlier heresy prosecutions, but they contained elements that would become central to later witchcraft ideology. The supposed toad worship, in particular, anticipated the animal familiars and shape-shifting demons that would feature prominently in 15th century witch trials. The alleged sexual orgies prefigured the Sabbath gatherings that demonologists would describe in elaborate detail. The accusations of weather magic Stedingers were said to cause storms that damaged their enemies' ships, and Krups established a direct link between supernatural power and political rebellion. What made the Stedinger case distinctive wasn't the specific nature of the accusations, but the scale and organization of the response. In 1232, Pope Gregory IX proclaimed a formal crusade against the Stedinger communities, offering the same spiritual rewards for fighting these peasant heretics that had previously been reserved for campaigns against Muslims in the Holy Land. This wasn't a local persecution managed by village courts or regional inquisitors. It was a military campaign sanctioned by the highest authorities of Christendom. The papal bull that authorized the crusade provides a fascinating window into early 13th century thinking about the relationship between political rebellion and supernatural evil. According to Gregory IX's analysis, the Stedingers' refusal to accept proper feudal and ecclesiastical authority wasn't simply criminal behavior, it was evidence of diabolic corruption that threatened the entire social order. Their prosperity and independence weren't the result of hard work and effective self-governance. They were the fruits of demonic assistance that had to be eliminated through holy war. The military campaign that followed was devastating in its thoroughness. Crusading armies drawn from across northern Germany converged on the Stedinger territories in 1234, bringing the full machinery of medieval warfare to bear against agricultural communities that had never been designed for military resistance. The Stedingers fought bravely, using their knowledge of local terrain to conduct an effective guerrilla campaign, but they were ultimately overwhelmed by superior numbers and professional military equipment. The final battle, fought near Altenesch in May 1234, ended with the virtual extermination of Stedinger military resistance. Contemporary chronicles describe scenes of extraordinary brutality, with crusading forces showing none of the restraint that usually governed warfare between Christian communities. This wasn't conquest, it was extermination, justified by the theological conviction that the Stedingers had forfeited their humanity through diabolic collaboration. The aftermath of the Stedinger Crusade established several precedents that would prove crucial to later developments in magical persecution. First, it demonstrated that accusations of supernatural evil could be used to justify the complete destruction of communities that had become politically inconvenient. The Stedingers' actual practice, whatever they may have been, were less important than their symbolic function as representatives of diabolic rebellion against proper authority. Second, the crusade showed how religious and secular authorities could coordinate their efforts to eliminate perceived threats. The papal authorization provided theological legitimacy, while regional nobles provided military resources and political motivation. This cooperation between church and state would become a hallmark of later witch-hunting campaigns, which typically required both religious justification and secular enforcement to achieve their goals. Third, the Stedinger affair established a template for collective punishment that transcended individual guilt or innocence. Unlike traditional criminal prosecutions, which focused on specific illegal acts committed by particular individuals, the crusade treated entire communities as collectively corrupted by supernatural evil. This precedent would prove particularly dangerous in later witch hunts, where accusations could spread to encompass extended family networks, occupational groups, or entire neighborhoods. The propaganda materials produced to justify the Stedinger Crusade also pioneered techniques that would become standard in later anti-witch literature. Chroniclers described the alleged heretical practices in lurid detail, emphasizing their sexual and blasphemous elements in ways designed to horrify Christian audiences. They portrayed the Stedingers as inhuman monsters who threatened not just political order, but the spiritual welfare of all Christendom. They used the language of contamination and corruption to suggest that the heretical influence would spread unless decisive action was taken. Perhaps most importantly, The Stedinger affair demonstrated that supernatural accusations could serve as effective tools for economic and political conquest. The marshy territories that the Stedingers had spent generations developing were quickly redistributed among the noble families who had participated in the crusade. The independent political institutions that had governed Stedinger communities were dismantled and replaced with conventional feudal relationships. The prosperity that had made the Stedingers targets for accusation became the reward for their accusers. This economic dimension of supernatural persecution would become increasingly important in later centuries, as witch hunts frequently involved the confiscation of accused persons' property and the redistribution of wealth within communities. The Stedinger precedent showed that religious justifications could be used to legitimize what were essentially predatory economic behaviors. The international attention that the Stedinger crusade attracted also helped to spread the techniques and justifications that had been developed for this particular campaign. Chronicle accounts of the affair circulated throughout medieval Europe, providing other regions with detailed models for how supernatural accusations could be used to address political problems. Legal scholars incorporated Stedinger precedents into their theoretical works on heresy and rebellion. Military commanders studied the tactical innovations that had made the crusade successful. In retrospect, the Stedinger affair represents a crucial bridge between the relatively limited magical persecutions of the early medieval period and the systematic witch hunts that would emerge in the 15th and 16th centuries. It showed how supernatural accusations could be scaled up from individual cases to encompass entire communities. It demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of combining religious authority with military force. It established precedents for collective punishment, property confiscation, and the treatment of political rebellion as evidence of diabolic corruption. The prosperous peasants who had drained the marshes of Lower Saxony probably never imagined that their success would be interpreted as evidence of supernatural evil. But in the evolving logic of medieval persecution, prosperity without proper subordination was inherently suspicious. Independence was potentially diabolic, and resistance to authority was proof of heretical corruption. The Stedinger affair was a preview of the much larger tragedies that would unfold when these assumptions were applied with systematic thoroughness to the problem of magic and witchcraft. SECCO d'Ascoli, 1327, Florence. Astrology on trial. In the spring of 1327, a crowd gathered in the Piazza Santa Croce in Florence to witness something unprecedented: the public execution of a university professor for practicing forbidden knowledge. The man being burned alive was Francesco Stabili, better known as Cecco d'Ascoli, one of the most brilliant and controversial intellectuals of his generation. His crime, according to the Inquisition tribunal that had condemned him, was using astrological calculations to make predictions that contradicted Christian doctrine and dabbling in magical practices that implied collaboration with demonic forces. Cecco's story illuminates the dangerous intersection between learned culture and supernatural suspicion that characterized the early 14th century. He was no village-wise woman or rural herbalist, was a professor of astrology at the University of Bologna, a court advisor to wealthy patrons, and the author of sophisticated treatises on natural philosophy and mathematical calculation. His execution represented a dramatic escalation in the Church's campaign against intellectual practices that seemed to challenge clerical authority over knowledge of the supernatural. The charges against Cecco were complex and revealed the evolving theological concerns that would shape later witchcraft prosecutions. He was accused of teaching that human actions were determined by stellar influences rather than by divine providence and free will. He had allegedly claimed that astrological calculations could predict the future with certainty, including events that Christian doctrine held to be subject only to God's will. Most dangerously, he had reportedly used his astrological knowledge to make predictions about the life of Christ that contradicted accepted gospel accounts. These weren't the crude magical accusations typically leveled against folk practitioners. CECCO's prosecutors had to grapple with sophisticated questions about the relationship between natural philosophy and religious doctrine, between mathematical calculation and divine revelation, between scholarly investigation and spiritual presumption. The case forced medieval courts to develop new categories of supernatural crime that could address the intellectual challenges posed by university-trained practitioners of learned magic. The astrological practices that brought CECCO to the stake were based on theoretical frameworks that had been developed over centuries of scholarly work. Medieval astrology wasn't simply fortune-telling or superstition. It was a complex mathematical discipline that attempted to calculate celestial influences on terrestrial events through precise observation and geometric analysis. Practitioners like CECCO used sophisticated instruments, consulted elaborate tables of planetary positions, and employed computational techniques that represented some of the most advanced mathematics of their era. The problem was that this scholarly sophistication made astrological predictions potentially more threatening to church authority than simple folk magic. When an illiterate peasant claimed to see the future in tea leaves or animal entrails, educated observers could dismiss these practices as ignorant superstition. But when a university professor used mathematical calculations to make predictions about political events, military campaigns, or religious developments, the implications were much more serious. CECCO's case was also complicated by his involvement in the political intrigues of early 14th century Italy. He had served as court astrologer to various noble patrons, providing them with horoscopes, election timing, and strategic advice based on celestial calculations. This political dimension made his supernatural knowledge directly threatening to existing power structures in ways that went beyond theological concerns about proper Christian doctrine. The specific accusations that led to his trial reveal the kinds of intellectual activities that church authorities found most problematic. CECCO had allegedly cast horoscopes for Christ, calculating the celestial influences that were present at the Nativity and using them to make predictions about Jesus' life and mission. From a purely astrological perspective, this was a reasonable scholarly exercise. If stellar influences affected all human lives, then logically they should have affected Christ as well. But from a theological perspective, CECCO's calculations were profoundly heretical. Christian doctrine held that Christ was both fully human and fully divine, and that his life had unfolded according to divine providence rather than natural causation. By subjecting Jesus to astrological analysis, CECCO was implicitly denying his divinity and reducing the central events of Christian salvation history to the mechanical operation of celestial forces. The trial proceedings also addressed CECCO's alleged practice of what we might call experimental magic attempts to test theoretical claims about supernatural forces through controlled procedures. He had reportedly constructed talismans designed to channel planetary influences, performed rituals intended to summon spiritual entities, and engaged in other activities that blurred the line between natural philosophy and sorcery. These experimental practices were particularly threatening because they suggested that supernatural forces could be investigated, understood, and potentially controlled through human reason and technique. This challenged the Church's monopoly on mediating between the natural and supernatural worlds, and it implied that divine mysteries could be penetrated through scholarly investigation rather than through revelation and faith. The public nature of CECCO's execution was carefully calculated to send a message to the intellectual community about the limits of acceptable scholarship. The Piazza Santa Croce was chosen as the execution site, partly because of its proximity to the University of Florence and its visibility to the scholarly community that might be tempted to follow CECCO's example. The ceremony itself was designed to demonstrate the fate that awaited intellectuals who pushed their investigations beyond the boundaries that church authorities were prepared to tolerate. Contemporary accounts of the execution emphasize both the scholarly sophistication of the condemned man and the religious necessity of his punishment. Chroniclers described CECCO as brilliant but misguided, a man whose intellectual gifts had been corrupted by pride and curiosity into dangerous forms of spiritual presumption. They portrayed his death as both a tragedy, loss of a remarkable mind, and a necessity for protecting Christian society from the corrosive effects of unauthorized supernatural knowledge. The Cecco d'Ascoli case established important precedents for later prosecutions of learned magic. It demonstrated that intellectual sophistication was no protection against supernatural accusations and might actually increase vulnerability by making magical practices seem more threatening to established authority. It showed how theological concerns about heresy could be combined with political anxieties about social disruption to justify extreme punishments for intellectual crimes. The case also revealed the kinds of evidence that courts would accept in prosecutions of learned practitioners. Unlike folk magic cases, which typically relied on testimony about specific harmful acts, learned magic prosecutions could be based on written works, teaching activities, and theoretical positions that seemed to challenge Christian doctrine. This expansion of relevant evidence made it much easier to prosecute intellectuals who inevitably left paper trails of their scholarly activities. Perhaps most importantly, Cecco's execution marked a turning point in the relationship between secular learning and religious authority. The early medieval period had seen a relatively permissive attitude toward natural philosophy and mathematical investigation, based on the assumption that the study of God's creation would ultimately confirm rather than challenge Christian truth. But by the 14th century, church authorities were becoming increasingly suspicious of intellectual activities that seemed to operate independently of clerical oversight. The flames that consumed Cecco d'Ascoli in Florence sent a clear message to scholars throughout Europe. The pursuit of supernatural knowledge was acceptable only within limits defined by religious authority, and those who transgressed those limits would face the ultimate penalty. It was a message that would shape intellectual life for centuries to come, and that would influence the development of witchcraft prosecutions as they evolved from simple accusations of harmful magic into systematic campaigns against unauthorized knowledge of all kinds. Alice KYTELER, 1324, Kilkenny, Petronilla de MEATH. In the autumn of 1324, the prosperous Anglo-Norman town of Kilkenny became the site of Ireland's first major witchcraft trial, a case that would establish precedents for supernatural persecution throughout the British Isles. At the center of the accusation stood Alice KYTELER, one of the wealthiest women in medieval Ireland, whose 4 marriages to successive wealthy husbands had made her a figure of both admiration and suspicion in a society where female prosperity was inherently problematic. Alice KYTELER was no ordinary target for magical accusations. She was a moneylender, property owner, and business operator whose financial activities had made her one of the most powerful economic actors in southeastern Ireland. Her house in Kilkenny was filled with luxury goods imported from across Europe. Her ledgers recorded complex financial arrangements with merchants, nobles, and church officials throughout the region. Her social position was so elevated that she regularly entertained bishops, nobles, and royal officials at elaborate dinners that demonstrated her wealth and influence. This prosperity became the foundation for accusations that would transform Alice from successful businesswoman to suspected witch in the space of a few months. The charges originated with her stepchildren from her various marriages, who alleged that she had used sorcery to kill their fathers and inherit their wealth. According to their testimony, Alice had employed a combination of poisoning and supernatural manipulation to ensure that her husbands died at convenient times and left her as their primary beneficiary. The specific accusations against Alice reveal how traditional maleficium charges were being elaborated into more complex demonological frameworks by the early 14th century. She was accused of preparing magical ointments from the remains of unbaptized children, of sacrificing animals to demons at crossroads outside Kilkenny, and of maintaining an intimate relationship with a demonic entity named Robin Artisan, who appeared to her in various forms, including that of a cat, a hairy black dog, and a dark-skinned man. These charges reflected the influence of learned demonological theory on what had begun as straightforward accusations of poisoning and inheritance fraud. The demon lover motif, in particular, drew on theological speculations about succubi and incubi that were becoming increasingly prominent in scholarly treatments of supernatural crime. The ritual elements animal sacrifice, crossroads meetings, magical ointments showed how local folklore was being interpreted through the lens of systematic diabolic theory. The political dimensions of the case were at least as important as its supernatural elements. Alice's primary prosecutor was Richard de Ledred, the recently appointed Bishop of Ossory, who had been educated at the University of Paris and was familiar with the most advanced continental approaches to heresy prosecution. De Ledred's campaign against Alice was part of a broader effort to assert ecclesiastical authority over the Anglo-Norman community in Kilkenny, which had developed a tradition of independence that the new bishop found intolerable. The ethnic and cultural tensions surrounding the case also reflected the complex colonial dynamics of medieval Ireland. Alice and her associates were members of the Anglo-Norman settler community that had conquered and colonized Ireland in the previous century. De Ledred, despite his continental education, represented the interests of the English crown and the universal church against what he saw as the excessive independence of colonial elites who had been allowed to operate with minimal oversight. The proceedings against Alice quickly escalated beyond individual accusations to encompass broader questions about authority, jurisdiction, and social order. When de Ledred attempted to arrest Alice on charges of heresy and sorcery, her supporters, including several of Kilkenny's most prominent citizens, resisted through both legal and physical means. They argued that ecclesiastical courts lacked jurisdiction over secular crimes, that the evidence against Alice was insufficient and unreliable, and that the bishop was exceeding his proper authority. This resistance led to a complex legal and political battle that drew in secular authorities from across the region. Alice's supporters appealed to the English crown for protection, arguing that de Ledred's prosecution threatened the rights and privileges of Anglo-Norman settlers throughout Ireland. The bishop responded by excommunicating Alice's defenders and placing Kilkenny under interdict, escalating the conflict to a level that threatened the stability of the entire regional government. The case took a decisive turn when Alice, recognizing that her political connections were insufficient to protect her against determined ecclesiastical prosecution, fled Ireland for England. Her escape left her associates and servants vulnerable to retaliation, and it was at this point that the case produced its most tragic outcome: the arrest, torture, and execution of Petronilla de MEATH. Petronilla was Alice's personal servant, a woman of lower social status who lacked the political connections and financial resources that had enabled her mistress to escape. According to the surviving trial records, she was subjected to intensive interrogation and torture until she confessed to participating in the alleged magical practices. Her confession provided the detailed narrative of diabolic worship and supernatural crime that de Ledred needed to justify his broader campaign against unauthorized spiritual activities. The content of Petronilla's confession reveals how torture could transform vague accusations into elaborate demonological narratives. Under questioning, she admitted to preparing magical potions, participating in nocturnal rituals, and serving as an intermediary between Alice and the demon Robin Artisan. She described ceremonies involving the sacrifice of roosters at crossroads, the preparation of magical candles from stolen church property, and the performance of blasphemous parodies of Christian sacraments. These confessions followed patterns that were becoming standardized in continental heresy prosecutions, suggesting that de Ledred or his assistants were familiar with the latest European techniques for extracting supernatural narratives from accused persons. The specific details: crossroads meetings, animal sacrifice, demonic relationships matched elements that were appearing in other contemporary cases across Europe, indicating how local accusations were being shaped by broader theoretical frameworks. Petronilla's execution in November 1324 made her the first person burned for heretical witchcraft in Ireland, establishing a precedent that would influence supernatural prosecutions throughout the British Isles for centuries to come. The fact that she died while her wealthy mistress escaped demonstrated how social and economic factors shaped the outcomes of witchcraft cases, with poor and socially marginal individuals bearing the ultimate costs of accusations that often originated in conflicts between their social superiors. The aftermath of the KYTELER case had lasting implications for Irish legal and social development. It established that ecclesiastical authorities could successfully prosecute witchcraft cases even in the face of significant secular resistance, provided they were willing to escalate conflicts to levels that threatened broader political stability. It demonstrated how supernatural accusations could be used to challenge the independence of colonial elites who had become too comfortable with their distance from metropolitan authority. The case also showed how individual magical accusations could expand to encompass broader social and political conflicts. What had begun as a dispute over inheritance rights and business practices had evolved into a systematic investigation of diabolic conspiracy that threatened to implicate dozens of Kilkenny's most prominent citizens. This pattern of expansion from individual charges to collective accusations would become characteristic of later witch hunts throughout Europe. Perhaps most significantly, the KYTELER case established the legal and procedural frameworks that would make future Irish witchcraft prosecutions possible. The successful use of torture to extract confessions, the acceptance of demonological theory as a basis for legal proceedings, and the demonstration that even wealthy and well-connected individuals could be vulnerable to supernatural accusations, all created precedents that would influence Irish legal culture for generations. The memory of Petronilla de Meath's death would haunt Irish consciousness long after the immediate political conflicts that had produced her execution were forgotten, serving as a reminder of the deadly consequences that could follow when personal conflicts, social tensions, and religious authority combined in the volatile mixture of witchcraft accusation. The Alpine forerunner, Johannes STEDELEN, c. 1390s, Bernese Oberland. High in the Swiss Alps, where the valleys narrow and the peaks cast long shadows even at midday, the village of Boltigen was struggling with a crisis that threatened to destroy the entire community. For 3 consecutive years, violent storms had struck at precisely the worst moments during haymaking season, when the precious grass lay cut and drying in the fields, during grain harvest when the wheat stood ready for gathering, during the autumn slaughter when families were preparing their winter meat supplies. Each storm seemed perfectly timed to cause maximum devastation, and each left the village a little poorer, a little more desperate, and a little more convinced that their misfortunes were not natural accidents. The man they eventually blamed for their troubles was Johannes STEDELEN, a middle-aged farmer who had lived in Boltigen all his life, but who had somehow accumulated a reputation for unusual knowledge about weather patterns and seasonal timing. Neighbors whispered that Johannes always seemed to know when storms were coming, that he made cryptic comments about the weather that later proved unnaturally accurate, and that he had been heard muttering strange words while standing in his fields during the strange, still moments that preceded the most destructive tempests. What made the accusations against Johannes particularly significant wasn't just their content, but their timing and location. The Bernese Oberland in the 1390s was experiencing the kind of social and environmental pressures that would prove fertile ground for witchcraft accusations throughout the Alpine regions. The climate was becoming more unpredictable, with extreme weather events occurring more frequently and with greater intensity. The traditional agricultural techniques that had sustained mountain communities for generations were proving inadequate for the new environmental challenges, and the social structures that had maintained order in small, relatively isolated villages were straining under the pressure of economic hardship and demographic change. The case against Johannes also marked an important transition in how Alpine communities understood and prosecuted magical crimes. Earlier generations had typically dealt with supernatural accusations through informal community processes, social ostracism, forced compensation, or voluntary exile. But by the late 14th century, these traditional methods were being supplemented and increasingly replaced by formal legal procedures that involved professional judges, written records, and systematic interrogation techniques borrowed from ecclesiastical courts. The judge who presided over Johannes Stedelen's case was Peter von Greyers, a member of the minor nobility who had been appointed to oversee legal affairs in the region by the Bernese government. Von Greyers had received legal training that included exposure to the latest continental developments in criminal procedure, including the use of torture for extracting confessions and the application of learned demonological theory to magical accusations. His handling of the Stedelen case would establish precedents that influenced supernatural prosecutions throughout the Alpine regions for the next century. The specific charges against Johannes revealed how traditional weather magic accusations were being elaborated into more systematic demonological frameworks. He was accused not just of causing storms through supernatural means, but of acquiring this power through a formal pact with demonic entities. According to the prosecution's theory, Johannes had agreed to serve Satan in exchange for the ability to control atmospheric conditions, and his weather magic was evidence of this diabolic relationship, rather than simply a criminal use of supernatural knowledge. This theoretical sophistication represented a crucial development in the evolution of witchcraft prosecutions. Earlier magical accusations had typically focused on specific, harmful acts. This person cursed, that person's cow, this woman caused that man's illness. But the charges against Johannes implied a much more elaborate supernatural conspiracy involving organized diabolic worship, formal contracts between humans and demons, and systematic attacks on Christian communities by forces of cosmic evil. The interrogation techniques used to extract Johannes's confession also marked a significant advance in the procedural sophistication of magical prosecutions. Rather than relying primarily on community testimony and reputation evidence, von Greyers employed systematic questioning designed to elicit detailed narratives about diabolic meetings, ritual practices, and supernatural capabilities. These techniques had been developed primarily for heresy prosecutions, but they proved adaptable to magical cases and much more effective than traditional methods for generating the kind of elaborate confessions that satisfied learned expectations about diabolic crime. Under pressure from these enhanced interrogation methods, Johannes eventually confessed to a range of supernatural activities that went far beyond the original weather magic accusations. He admitted to attending nocturnal gatherings where he and other devil worshippers met with demonic entities to plan attacks on Christian communities. He described rituals involving the sacrifice of animals, the preparation of magical potions, and the performance of ceremonies that inverted and mocked Christian sacraments. He provided names of other alleged participants in these gatherings, including several women from neighboring villages who were subsequently arrested and interrogated. These confessions established several motifs that would become central to Alpine witchcraft prosecutions over the next century. The emphasis on nocturnal gatherings anticipated the Sabbath mythology that would dominate later witch hunts. The focus on weather magic reflected the particular vulnerabilities of Alpine agricultural communities. The involvement of multiple participants implied organized diabolic conspiracies rather than individual criminal acts, and the detailed descriptions of ritual practices provided courts with standardized narratives that could be applied to subsequent cases. The execution of Johannes Stedelen in the mid-1390s was carried out with ceremonial formality designed to demonstrate both the seriousness of his crimes and the effectiveness of judicial authority in protecting Christian communities from supernatural threats. The pyre was built in a public location where it could be witnessed by residents from throughout the region, and the proceedings included religious ceremonies that emphasized the cosmic significance of the conflict between Christian order and diabolic chaos. The regional impact of the STEDELEN case extended far beyond the immediate community where it occurred. News of the trial and execution spread throughout the Alpine valleys, carried by traders, travelers, and seasonal migrants who moved between different communities for economic reasons. The procedural innovations that von Greyerz had employed were studied and adopted by other judges facing similar cases. The demonological theories that had been used to explain Johannes's alleged crimes became part of the intellectual framework that Alpine courts applied to subsequent magical accusations. Perhaps most importantly, the STEDELEN case demonstrated that systematic witch hunting was possible and potentially profitable for the authorities who conducted it. The trial had enhanced von Greyer's reputation as an effective judge, had provided the Bernese government with an opportunity to demonstrate its commitment to protecting Christian communities, and had created legal precedents that could be applied to future cases. The confiscation of Johannes's property had provided modest financial benefits, and the elimination of a suspected weather witch had satisfied community demands for action against supernatural threats. The success of the STEDELEN prosecution encouraged similar cases throughout the Alpine regions over the following decades. Villages that had previously dealt with magical accusations through informal methods began demanding formal trials. Judges who had been reluctant to pursue supernatural cases became more willing to accept weather magic accusations as legitimate legal matters, and the theoretical frameworks that had been developed for the STEDELEN case were refined and systematized into the elaborate demonological theories that would justify the massive witch hunts of the 15th century. The weather-beaten peaks of the Bernese Oberland had witnessed something more than just another medieval execution. They had seen the birth of systematic alpine witch hunting, a development that would transform these mountain valleys into some of the most dangerous places in Europe for anyone suspected of supernatural knowledge or diabolic association. ELEANOR COBHAM, the Witch of Eye, 1441, England. The conspiracy that would bring down Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, began not with accusations of devil worship or weather magic, but with a question that had tormented the English nobility for generations: who would inherit the throne? In the summer of 1441, as King Henry VI struggled with the mental instability that would eventually plunge England into civil war, Eleanor commissioned a horoscope to determine whether she might someday become Queen of England. It was a reasonable question from her perspective. Eleanor's husband, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was the king's uncle and heir presumptive until Henry produced a son. Eleanor had been married to the Duke for nearly 20 years, had established herself as one of the most influential women at court, and had every reason to be interested in her potential future status. The astrological consultation she sought was the kind of service that wealthy nobles routinely purchased from learned practitioners throughout medieval Europe. But in the fevered political atmosphere of 1441, Eleanor's horoscope became the foundation for accusations that would transform her from duchess to convicted witch in a matter of months. The charges against her revealed how magical accusations could serve as weapons in the deadly serious game of dynastic politics, where the stakes were nothing less than control of the English crown and the future direction of the kingdom. The case began with the arrest of Marjorie Jourdemain, a cunning woman from the village of Eye who had built a reputation as one of London's most skilled practitioners of beneficial magic. Marjorie's clients included merchants seeking business success, young women looking for love charms, and families hoping for protection against disease and misfortune. She was what medieval people called a wise woman, someone whose knowledge of herbs, charms, and ritual procedures made her a valuable resource for people facing problems that conventional medicine and religion couldn't address. Marjorie's arrest on charges of sorcery might have remained a routine prosecution of folk magic, but the investigation quickly revealed connections that elevated the case to the highest levels of English politics. Under interrogation, Marjorie admitted to providing magical services to Eleanor Cobham, services that allegedly included not just the controversial horoscope, but also attempts to use supernatural means to ensure that Eleanor would bear children and that her husband would outlive his rivals for the throne. These revelations transformed what had begun as a case against a village cunning woman into a prosecution for high treason. According to English law, using supernatural means to predict or influence the death of the king constituted treason regardless of the specific methods employed. By commissioning a horoscope that addressed the king's mortality and potential succession, Eleanor had technically committed a capital crime, even if her intentions were entirely innocent. The political motivations behind the prosecution became clear when the case expanded to encompass Eleanor's other associates, including Roger Bolingbroke, a clerk and scholar who had provided astrological services to various noble families, and Thomas Southwell, a canon of St. Stephen's, Westminster, who had assisted in the preparation of Eleanor's horoscope. These men represented the scholarly and ecclesiastical networks that had made learned magic available to the English nobility, and their prosecution sent a clear message about the dangers of providing supernatural services to politically sensitive clients. The trial proceedings revealed the complex intersection of magical practice, political conspiracy, and gender anxiety that characterized supernatural accusations involving elite women. Eleanor was portrayed not as an innocent client who had purchased routine astrological services, but as the primary organizer of a diabolic conspiracy aimed at using supernatural means to alter the royal succession. Her gender made these accusations particularly compelling to contemporary audiences who were predisposed to believe that women were more susceptible to demonic influence and more likely to use underhanded methods to achieve political goals. The specific charges against Eleanor also reflected the influence of continental demonological theory on English legal thinking. She was accused not just of commissioning magical services, but of actively participating in ritual practices that implied diabolic worship. According to the prosecution's narrative, Eleanor had attended nocturnal ceremonies where she and her associates had invoked demonic powers, performed blasphemous parodies of Christian rituals, and engaged in sexual relationships with supernatural entities. These elaborate accusations bore little relationship to the actual evidence in the case, which consisted primarily of astrological charts, herbal preparations, and written materials related to divination and natural magic. But they served important political functions by transforming Eleanor from a potentially sympathetic figure, a noblewoman who had sought reasonable information about her future, into a monstrous traitor whose crimes justified the harshest possible punishment. The trial of Marjorie Jourdemain proceeded according to different legal standards than Eleanor's case, reflecting the class distinctions that shaped medieval criminal justice. As a commoner accused of sorcery, Marjorie faced ecclesiastical charges that could result in execution by burning if she was convicted of heretical practices. As a duchess accused of treason, Eleanor faced secular charges that carried different penalties, but were prosecuted according to procedures that provided somewhat more protection for defendants of noble status. Marjorie's fate was sealed by confessions extracted under torture that provided detailed narratives of diabolic worship and supernatural conspiracy. She admitted to preparing love potions for Eleanor, to casting spells designed to ensure the duchess's fertility, and to participating in ritual ceremonies that invoked demonic assistance for achieving political goals. These confessions followed standardized patterns that had been developed in continental witch trials, suggesting that English prosecutors were adapting international techniques for extracting supernatural narratives from accused persons. The execution of Marjorie Jourdemain at Smithfield in October 1441 made her one of the first people burned for witchcraft in England, establishing a precedent that would influence English supernatural prosecutions for centuries to come. Her death was orchestrated as a public spectacle, designed to demonstrate the fate that awaited anyone who used magical means to threaten royal authority. The crowds that gathered to witness her burning included representatives from across English society, from noble courtiers to London merchants to rural visitors who had travelled to the capital specifically to see the notorious Witch of Eye meet her end. Eleanor's punishment reflected both her noble status and the political necessities that had motivated her prosecution. Rather than facing execution, she was sentenced to public penance and life imprisonment penalties that removed her from political influence, while avoiding the diplomatic complications that might have resulted from executing the wife of the king's uncle. Her public humiliation involved walking barefoot through London streets carrying a candle, a ceremony designed to demonstrate her submission to royal authority and her repentance for challenging the established order. The broader political consequences of the ELEANOR Cobham case extended far beyond the immediate participants. The prosecution effectively ended Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester's influence at court, removing a potential rival to other noble factions competing for control over the unstable king. It demonstrated that magical accusations could be used to neutralize political opponents who might be difficult to attack through conventional means. And it established precedents for using supernatural charges to prosecute treason cases where direct evidence of political conspiracy was lacking. The case also revealed how magical accusations could serve as vehicles for expressing broader anxieties about female power, noble independence, and the stability of royal authority. Eleanor's prosecution coincided with a period of particular uncertainty about English political direction, when the king's mental illness was becoming increasingly apparent, and when different factions were maneuvering for advantage in anticipation of potential succession crises. The memory of Eleanor Cobham's disgrace would influence English attitudes toward magic and politics for generations to come, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking supernatural assistance for political purposes and demonstrating the effectiveness of witchcraft accusations as tools for eliminating inconvenient political figures. The case established that even the highest-ranking nobles were vulnerable to supernatural charges if those charges served the interests of their rivals, and it showed how learned magic could be reframed as diabolic conspiracy when political circumstances made such reframing advantageous. The fate of Marjorie Jourdemain also had lasting implications for English cunning folk and magical practitioners. Her execution demonstrated that providing services to elite clients could be extraordinarily dangerous if those clients became politically inconvenient. It showed that the traditional protections that had shielded folk practitioners, their local knowledge, community connections, and practical usefulness were insufficient when magical accusations became entangled with high politics, and it established legal precedents that would make future prosecutions of magical practitioners more likely to result in execution rather than the lighter penalties that had previously been common. The Eleanor Cobham case thus represents a crucial moment in the development of English witchcraft prosecutions, showing how continental demonological theories could be adapted to serve distinctly English political purposes, and how magical accusations could be weaponized in the context of dynastic competition and royal instability. The flames that consumed Marjorie Jourdemain at Smithfield were fueled by political ambitions that had little to do with supernatural crime, but their light would cast long shadows over English attitudes toward magic, gender, and political authority for centuries to come. The case also demonstrated how individual magical accusations could expand to encompass broader networks of alleged conspiracy, a pattern that would become increasingly common in later witch trials. What had begun as a routine consultation about astrological timing had escalated into a systematic investigation of diabolic plotting that threatened to implicate dozens of scholars, clerics, and courtiers who had provided various forms of supernatural services to noble clients. This expansion from individual charges to collective accusations would become one of the most dangerous characteristics of early modern witch hunting, as single cases generated the momentum for much larger campaigns of persecution. In the political calculation of medieval England, Eleanor Cobham and Marjorie Jourdemain had become expendable assets in a larger game of dynastic chess. Their destruction served the interests of rival factions, while sending clear messages about the limits of acceptable behavior for both noble women and magical practitioners. The intersection of their fates at the moment of Marjorie's execution symbolized the deadly convergence of political ambition, supernatural suspicion, and gendered vulnerability that would characterize witch hunting throughout the early modern period. The horoscope that Eleanor had commissioned to learn about her future had indeed proved prophetic, though not in the way she had intended. It had revealed her destiny with perfect accuracy: disgrace, imprisonment, and a place in history as one of the first English noble women to be destroyed by accusations of diabolic conspiracy. The stars, it seemed, had told the truth after all. Valais witch hunts, 1428, 1447, Upper Rhône. In the narrow valleys of the Upper Rhône, where the river carved its way between towering peaks toward Lake Geneva, the year 1428 began, like any other, in the harsh rhythm of alpine life. The villages scattered along the valley floor, Sierre, Luc, and dozens of smaller settlements clinging to the mountainsides were emerging from another brutal winter, counting their losses in livestock and grain stores while preparing for the demanding work of spring planting. But this particular spring would bring horrors that no alpine community had ever experienced, as accusations of weather magic and diabolic conspiracy exploded into the first systematic witch hunt in European history. The Valais region was uniquely positioned to become the birthplace of mass witch persecution. The valley formed a crucial transportation corridor between northern and southern Europe, which meant that ideas, legal procedures, and demonological theories could spread rapidly between different jurisdictions. The political situation was complex and unstable, with secular and ecclesiastical authorities competing for control over territories that generated substantial revenue from trade and agriculture. And the environmental conditions were severe enough that communities lived in constant anxiety about weather patterns, crop failures, and the natural disasters that could devastate entire settlements without warning. The initial accusations followed patterns that had become familiar in earlier alpine cases. A series of violent storms had destroyed crops across multiple villages during the previous harvest season. Several prominent community members had died under circumstances that seemed suspicious to their neighbors. Livestock had succumbed to diseases that local remedies couldn't cure. In the logic of supernatural causation that governed alpine thinking, these misfortunes demanded explanation, and explanation increasingly meant identifying the human agents who had caused them through magical means. What transformed these routine accusations into something unprecedented was the systematic approach that local authorities brought to investigating them. Rather than treating each case as an isolated incident, judges began to see individual accusations as evidence of a broader conspiracy that required comprehensive investigation. This shift from isolated prosecutions to systematic campaigns marked the birth of the witch hunt as a distinct form of legal and social persecution. The theoretical framework that guided these investigations drew heavily on the demonological innovations that had been developed over the previous century. Judges no longer assumed that accused persons were simply individual practitioners of harmful magic. Instead, they operated on the theory that all magical activity was ultimately diabolic in origin, that practitioners necessarily belonged to organized groups that met regularly for worship and instruction, and that these groups posed systematic threats to Christian communities that required equally systematic responses. The procedural innovations were as important as the theoretical ones. Valais authorities employed torture more extensively and systematically than had been typical in earlier magical cases. They developed standardized interrogation techniques designed to extract specific types of information about diabolic gatherings, ritual practices, and conspiracy networks. They created bureaucratic systems for recording, analyzing, and acting on the intelligence that torture sessions generated. And they established coordination mechanisms that allowed information from one case to influence investigations in other jurisdictions. The confessions that these enhanced procedures produced were unlike anything that earlier magical prosecutions had generated. Accused persons didn't simply admit to casting spells or causing specific harms. Instead, they provided detailed narratives about elaborate diabolic organizations that met regularly in remote locations, performed ceremonies that inverted Christian rituals, and coordinated systematic attacks on Christian communities throughout the region. According to these tortured testimonies, the diabolic conspiracy operated according to sophisticated organizational principles. New members were recruited through a combination of seduction and coercion, with experienced witches targeting vulnerable individuals, recent widows, impoverished farmers, young people struggling with personal problems, and gradually drawing them into deeper levels of commitment. Initiation ceremonies involved formal renunciation of Christian faith, sexual relationships with demonic entities, and the performance of blasphemous acts that sealed the convert's commitment to diabolic service. The regular gatherings, which came to be known as Sabbaths, allegedly involved dozens or even hundreds of participants who traveled to remote locations through supernatural means, flying through the air, shape-shifting into animal forms, or moving invisibly across vast distances. These meetings combined worship of diabolic entities with practical instruction in harmful magic, social activities that bonded conspirators together, and planning sessions where attacks on Christian communities were coordinated. The specific magical techniques that Sabbath participants allegedly learned included weather control methods that could generate storms, hail, and droughts targeted at particular locations. They learned how to cause diseases in humans and animals, how to destroy crops through supernatural means, and how to infiltrate Christian communities as seemingly normal residents, while secretly working to undermine social order and spiritual welfare. These elaborate confessions served multiple functions for the authorities who extracted them. They provided justification for the intensive investigations that were disrupting normal legal and social processes throughout the region. They explained patterns of misfortune and disaster that communities had been struggling to understand. They identified networks of alleged conspirators who could be subjected to further investigation. And they demonstrated the effectiveness of enhanced interrogation techniques in uncovering hidden threats to Christian society. The expansion of investigations from individual cases to systematic campaigns created momentum that proved difficult to control. Each confession potentially implicated dozens of additional suspects, who then had to be arrested, interrogated, and either convicted or cleared. The bureaucratic systems that had been established to manage these processes generated enormous amounts of paperwork, arrest warrants, interrogation records, property inventories, execution orders that required substantial administrative resources to process. The economic dimensions of the witch hunts also contributed to their expansion and persistence. Convicted witches forfeited their property to the authorities who prosecuted them, which meant that successful cases generated revenue that could fund additional investigations. The confiscation system created financial incentives for pursuing supernatural accusations, particularly against relatively prosperous targets whose estates would yield substantial returns. The social dynamics within accused communities became increasingly distorted as investigations continued. Normal patterns of cooperation, trust, and mutual support broke down as neighbors began to suspect each other of diabolic conspiracy. Traditional authorities, village elders, local priests, established families found their influence undermined by accusations that could target anyone regardless of previous social standing. The investigative process itself became a form of social control that reshaped community relationships according to new principles of suspicion and surveillance. The gender patterns of valet prosecutions reflected broader European trends, but with some distinctive regional characteristics. Women comprised the majority of those accused, particularly older women who possessed knowledge of herbal medicine, midwifery, or other forms of traditional healing. But men were also prosecuted in significant numbers, often as alleged leaders of diabolic organizations or as specialists in weather magic and other forms of harmful sorcery that required substantial supernatural power. The geographical spread of accusations followed the transportation networks that connected different valley communities. Cases often began in market towns where people from different villages gathered for trade and social interaction, then spread along the routes that connected these centers to smaller settlements. The patterns of accusation revealed how rumor, suspicion, and legal precedent moved through the complex social networks that bound Alpine communities together. The resistance that some communities and individuals offered to the witch hunts was sporadic and largely ineffective. A few local officials refused to cooperate with investigations. Some communities attempted to protect accused members, and occasional appeals were made to higher authorities for intervention. But the legal and theoretical frameworks that justified the persecutions were sufficiently sophisticated to overcome most forms of resistance, and the momentum of ongoing investigations made systematic opposition extremely difficult. The international attention that the Valais hunts attracted helped to spread both the techniques and the justifications that had made them possible. Chroniclers from across Europe wrote accounts of the unprecedented scale and systematic nature of the persecutions. Legal scholars studied the procedural innovations that Valais authorities had developed. Demonological theorists incorporated Valais confession materials into their systematic treatments of diabolic conspiracy. The knowledge and experience gained in these Alpine valleys became available to prosecutors throughout Europe who faced similar accusations in their own jurisdictions. By 1447, when the intensity of prosecutions finally began to diminish, the Valais witch hunts had fundamentally altered European thinking about magical crime. They had demonstrated that accusations of supernatural conspiracy could be investigated systematically and prosecuted on a massive scale. They had shown how individual cases could be linked together into comprehensive campaigns against alleged diabolic organizations. They had proven the effectiveness of enhanced interrogation techniques for generating the kind of detailed confessions that satisfied learned expectations about supernatural crime. The legacy of the Valais hunts extended far beyond the immediate region where they occurred. The theoretical frameworks, procedural innovations, and institutional mechanisms that had been developed during these campaigns became available to prosecutors throughout Europe who were dealing with similar accusations. The precedent of systematic witch hunting had been established, and the tools necessary for replicating it elsewhere had been tested and refined through nearly 2 decades of intensive application. The mountains that had witnessed the birth of systematic witch persecution would remember the screams that echoed through their valleys for centuries to come, as community after community discovered that the techniques pioneered in the Upper Rhône could be adapted to local conditions and applied to local accusations with devastating effectiveness. Fribourg, Gruyère, 1440s, Swiss Plateau. The rolling hills and fertile valleys of Fribourg and Gruyère, stretching across the Swiss plateau between the Lake Geneva region and the Central Alps, should have been a refuge from the supernatural terrors that had consumed the Valais. Here, the landscapes were gentler, the communities more prosperous, and the political structures more stable than in the harsh mountain valleys where systematic witch hunting had first emerged. Yet by the mid-1440s, these comfortable pastoral regions were experiencing their own waves of accusation and persecution. As the techniques and theories developed in the Alps proved devastatingly adaptable to different social and environmental conditions, the spread of witch hunting from the Valais to Fribourg and Gruyère revealed how supernatural accusations could transcend regional boundaries and establish themselves in communities that had previously been relatively immune to such concerns. The transmission occurred through multiple channels: legal professionals who moved between different jurisdictions, merchants, and travelers who carried news of dramatic events. and the formal networks of correspondence that connected ecclesiastical and secular authorities across the Swiss territories. The specific triggers for accusations in Fribourg and Gruyère differed significantly from those that had initiated the Valais hunts, demonstrating how the witch hunt phenomenon could adapt to local conditions while maintaining its essential characteristics. Rather than focusing primarily on weather, magic, and crop failures, the plateau regions saw accusations that centered more heavily on livestock diseases, problems with dairy production, and conflicts over grazing rights and agricultural resources. The economic foundation of communities in Fribourg and Gruyère rested heavily on cattle raising and cheese production, activities that required extensive cooperation between different households and that created complex networks of mutual dependence and potential conflict. When cattle sickened with mysterious diseases, when cheese-making processes failed for unexplained reasons, or when traditional grazing arrangements were disrupted by environmental problems, these communities had strong incentives to seek supernatural explanations for their difficulties. The social structure of plateau communities also provided different targets and different dynamics for supernatural accusations than had been typical in the mountain valleys. The relative prosperity of the region meant that there were more people with substantial property to confiscate, which created stronger economic incentives for pursuing witch cases. The more complex political arrangements, involving overlapping jurisdictions between local nobles, ecclesiastical authorities, and emerging urban centers, created more opportunities for different groups to use supernatural accusations to advance their competitive interests. The procedural sophistication that authorities brought to these cases reflected the knowledge and experience that had been gained during the Valais campaigns. Rather than developing investigative techniques through trial and error, prosecutors in Fribourg and Gruyère began with systematic approaches that had already been tested and refined in other contexts. This meant that the witch hunts in these regions could achieve devastating effectiveness much more quickly than had been possible during the pioneering efforts in the mountain valleys. The interrogation techniques employed in plateau witch trials were particularly sophisticated, incorporating standardized questioning procedures that had been developed to elicit specific types of information about diabolic activities. Accused persons were not simply asked whether they had committed magical crimes. Instead, they were subjected to detailed questioning about their participation in Sabbath gatherings, their relationships with demonic entities, their knowledge of other conspirators, and their involvement in specific harmful acts that investigators had identified as potentially supernatural in origin. The confession templates that emerged from these interrogations revealed how local accusations were being shaped by broader theoretical frameworks that had developed across multiple regions of supernatural persecution. Accused persons in Freiburg provided detailed accounts of diabolic meetings that closely paralleled narratives that had been extracted in the Valais. Despite the different environmental and social conditions that characterized the two regions, this similarity suggested that interrogation techniques were effectively imposing standardized narrative frameworks on local accusations rather than simply discovering whatever diabolic activities might actually have been occurring. The Sabbath descriptions that plateau confessions contained were adapted to local, geographical, and cultural conditions while maintaining the essential elements that had become standard in demonological theory. The alleged meeting sites were typically located in forests or remote valleys that would have been familiar to local residents, but that were sufficiently isolated to make supernatural gatherings plausible. The participants were described as traveling to these locations through methods night flights, shape-shifting, supernatural transportation that had become standard elements of Sabbath mythology throughout the regions where systematic witch hunting was occurring. The ritual activities that confessions described also reflected local, religious, and cultural patterns, while conforming to broader expectations about diabolic worship. The alleged ceremonies involved inversions of familiar Christian practices, masses said backwards, crosses held upside down, sacred texts desecrated in specific ways that would have been particularly shocking to communities that had developed strong traditions of orthodox religious observance. The sexual activities that were allegedly performed at Sabbath gatherings reflected contemporary anxieties about female sexuality and social order that were particularly acute in communities where traditional gender roles were being challenged by economic and social changes. The expansion of investigations from individual cases to systematic campaigns proceeded more rapidly in Fribourg and Gruyère than had been typical in earlier witch hunts, partly because authorities had already developed effective bureaucratic systems for managing complex supernatural prosecutions. The administrative mechanisms for recording confessions, tracking suspects, coordinating between different jurisdictions, and managing the property confiscations that resulted from successful cases were already available, and could be implemented without the lengthy development periods that had been necessary in pioneer regions. The resistance that some communities offered to the expanding witch hunts took forms that reflected the specific political and social structures of the plateau regions. Unlike the mountain valleys, where resistance had typically been sporadic and individual, the more complex political arrangements of Fribourg and Gruyère allowed for more organized opposition to supernatural prosecutions. Some local nobles used their political influence to protect accused persons. Some communities attempted to negotiate with prosecutors to limit the scope of investigations, and some ecclesiastical authorities raised concerns about the theological and legal foundations of the accusations. These resistance efforts were only partially successful, but they did create complications for prosecutors that had not been typical in earlier witch hunts. The need to navigate complex political relationships to justify investigative procedures to skeptical authorities, and to maintain the support of communities that were becoming increasingly disrupted by ongoing prosecutions, created pressures that sometimes limited the expansion of cases or forced modifications in investigative techniques. The gender patterns of accusations in Fribourg and Gruyère reflected both regional characteristics and broader European trends in supernatural prosecution. Women continued to comprise the majority of those accused, but the specific categories of women who were targeted differed somewhat from patterns that had been typical in mountain communities. The plateau regions saw more accusations against women who were involved in commercial activities: market vendors, tavern keepers, women who participated in regional trade networks, reflecting the more complex economic structures that characterized these more prosperous areas. The involvement of men in plateau witch cases also followed distinctive patterns that reflected local, social, and economic conditions. Male suspects were often accused of specializing in forms of harmful magic that were particularly relevant to livestock raising and dairy production, causing cattle diseases, spoiling milk, disrupting cheese-making processes. These accusations reflected both the economic importance of these activities in plateau communities and the gendered division of labor that made men more likely to be involved in certain aspects of agricultural production. The international significance of the Fribourg and Gruyère witch hunts lay partly in their demonstration that systematic supernatural persecution could be successfully adapted to different regional conditions and social structures. The techniques that had been developed in harsh mountain environments proved equally effective in prosperous agricultural regions, suggesting that witch hunting was a flexible phenomenon that could establish itself wherever appropriate combinations of legal, social, and ideological conditions existed. The documentation that these cases generated also contributed significantly to the intellectual development of demonological theory throughout Europe. The detailed confession records, legal proceedings, and administrative documents that resulted from plateau prosecutions provided systematic information about alleged diabolic activities that scholars could analyze and incorporate into increasingly sophisticated theoretical frameworks. This documentation helped to standardize European thinking about supernatural crime and provided precedents that influenced prosecutions in regions that had not yet experienced large-scale witch hunts. The memory of the Fribourg and Gruyère persecutions would influence Swiss attitudes towards supernatural crime for generations to come, establishing precedents and procedures that could be activated whenever local conditions created pressures for supernatural explanations of community problems. The comfortable valleys and rolling hills of the Swiss plateau had proven that no community was immune to the devastating dynamics of systematic witch hunting, and that prosperity and political stability provided no protection against the forces that could transform neighbor into enemy and suspicion into deadly persecution. Lausanne, the Vaud, 1440s, 1450s. The shores of Lake Geneva, where the city of Lausanne rose in terraced splendor above one of Europe's most beautiful natural harbors, seemed an unlikely setting for supernatural terror. This was a region blessed with extraordinary natural advantages: fertile soils perfect for viticulture, a temperate climate moderated by the vast lake, and a strategic location that made it a crucial link in the trade networks connecting northern and southern Europe. The vineyards that covered the hillsides above the lake produced wines that were coveted across the continent, while the city itself had become a center of learning, commerce, and ecclesiastical authority that rivaled Geneva and Bern in importance. Yet by the middle of the 15th century, these same natural advantages had become sources of vulnerability that made the Vaud region particularly susceptible to supernatural accusations and systematic persecution. The very prosperity that viticulture had brought to the region created social tensions and economic competition that could easily be channeled into magical accusations when environmental or political conditions created community stress. The wine economy that dominated the region was particularly vulnerable to weather-related disasters that could be interpreted in supernatural terms. A late spring frost could destroy an entire year's vintage in a single night. Hailstorms could strip ripe grapes from the vines just days before harvest. Excessive rain during the growing season could promote fungal diseases that made wine undrinkable, while drought could stress the vines to the point where they produced little or no fruit. The timing of these weather events was crucial. The same storm that would be merely inconvenient in winter could be catastrophic if it occurred during the critical weeks of harvest season. The social structure of viticulture also created distinctive patterns of vulnerability to supernatural accusations. Wine production required extensive specialized knowledge about plant diseases, fermentation processes, and storage techniques that could easily be interpreted as magical expertise when things went wrong. The seasonal labor demands of viticulture brought together workers from different communities, creating social networks that could rapidly spread rumors and accusations across wide geographical areas. And the economic importance of wine production meant that crop failures had implications that extended far beyond individual households to affect entire regional economies. The specific triggers for witch hunting in the Vaud reflected these distinctive regional characteristics. Rather than focusing primarily on grain crops and livestock, as had been typical in other regions, accusations in the Lausanne area centered heavily on alleged attacks against vineyards and wine production. Suspected witches were accused of causing frosts that killed grape buds, of summoning hailstorms that destroyed ripening fruit, of introducing diseases that spoiled wine during fermentation, and of cursing wine cellars so that stored vintages turned to vinegar. The lake itself became a significant element in local supernatural accusations. As communities developed, elaborate theories about how accused witches used the vast body of water for transportation to diabolic gatherings and as a source of supernatural power for their magical activities. Confessions extracted from accused persons described nocturnal boat journeys to remote islands where Sabbath meetings were held, rituals performed on isolated beaches under the cover of darkness, and magical practices that drew power from the mysterious depths of the lake. These lacustrine elements of Vaud witch beliefs reflected both the practical realities of life in a lake region and the mythological associations that large bodies of water had acquired in European folk culture. Lake Geneva was large enough that storms could arise suddenly and with devastating effect on small boats, which made supernatural explanations for drownings and shipwrecks psychologically compelling. The lake's great depth and the mysteries it concealed made it a natural location for supernatural activities in the popular imagination. And the economic importance of fishing and lake transport meant that communities had strong interests in finding explanations for maritime disasters that could be addressed through human action. The urban dimensions of witch hunting in the Lausanne area also distinguished these prosecutions from the primarily rural campaigns that had characterized earlier supernatural persecutions. As a significant ecclesiastical center, Lausanne had a large population of clergy, scholars, and administrative personnel who brought sophisticated theoretical knowledge to supernatural accusations. The city's importance as a commercial hub meant that news of witch trials spread rapidly to other regions, while the presence of skilled craftsmen, merchants, and professionals created more complex social relationships that could generate distinctive patterns of accusation and resistance. The ecclesiastical authorities who oversaw supernatural prosecutions in the Vaud brought particularly systematic approaches to these cases, reflecting both their theoretical sophistication and their administrative experience with complex legal proceedings. The bishops and inquisitors who directed investigations had access to the most advanced demonological literature of their time, and they employed interrogation techniques that had been refined through decades of experience with heresy prosecutions across Europe. The confession narratives that these sophisticated interrogation methods produced were among the most elaborate and detailed that had yet been recorded in European witch trials. Accused persons provided extensive descriptions of diabolic organizations that allegedly operated throughout the Lake Geneva region, with membership lists that included hundreds of participants from dozens of different communities. These confessions described recruitment techniques, initiation ceremonies, organizational hierarchies, and operational procedures that portrayed diabolic conspiracy as a sophisticated and systematic phenomenon rather than a collection of individual criminal acts. The Sabbath gatherings that Vaud confessions described were adapted to local geographical and cultural conditions, while maintaining the essential elements that had become standard in demonological theory throughout the regions where systematic witch hunting was occurring. The alleged meeting sites included locations that would have been familiar to local residents: isolated clearings in the Jura forests, remote valleys in the pre-alpine foothills, islands in Lake Geneva that could be reached only by boat. The transportation methods that participants allegedly used to reach these gatherings reflected both traditional folk beliefs about supernatural travel and the practical realities of movement in a region where water transport was common and important. The ritual activities that confessions described also showed sophisticated adaptation to local religious and cultural patterns. The alleged ceremonies involved detailed inversions of the Catholic Mass that would have been particularly shocking to communities with strong traditions of Orthodox religious observance. The feasting that supposedly occurred at Sabbath gatherings featured foods that were significant in local culture: wine from specific vineyards, cheese from particular alpine regions, bread made according to traditional regional recipes. The sexual activities that were allegedly performed reflected contemporary anxieties about social order and moral behavior that were particularly acute in urban environments where traditional community controls were weakening. The expansion of investigations from individual cases to systematic campaigns proceeded with particular efficiency in the Vaud, partly because of the administrative sophistication that ecclesiastical authorities brought to these proceedings. The bureaucratic systems for recording confessions, tracking suspects, coordinating between different jurisdictions, and managing property confiscations were more advanced than had been typical in earlier witch hunts, allowing investigations to process larger numbers of cases with greater speed and thoroughness. The economic incentives for pursuing supernatural prosecutions were also particularly strong in the Vaud, where the prosperity of wine-producing communities meant that property confiscations could yield substantial returns. The systematic nature of investigations meant that prosecutors could target relatively wealthy suspects whose estates would provide significant funding for continued operations, creating financial dynamics that encouraged the expansion and persistence of witch hunting campaigns. The resistance that some communities and individuals offered to expanding supernatural prosecutions took distinctive forms that reflected the specific political and social structures of the region. The urban character of Lausanne meant that there were more legal professionals available to challenge the procedures and theoretical foundations of witch trials. The commercial importance of the region meant that some merchants and craftsmen had sufficient political influence to protect accused persons or to limit the scope of investigations. And the ecclesiastical significance of the area meant that some church authorities raised theological objections to the most extreme aspects of supernatural persecution. These resistance efforts achieved mixed results, sometimes succeeding in protecting individual accused persons or limiting the expansion of particular cases, but generally failing to halt the overall momentum of supernatural prosecution. The theoretical and legal frameworks that justified witch hunting had become sufficiently sophisticated to overcome most forms of opposition, and the institutional mechanisms for conducting systematic persecution had been refined to the point where they could operate effectively despite occasional challenges. The international significance of the Vaud witch hunts lay partly in their demonstration that systematic supernatural persecution could be successfully established in urban environments and prosperous commercial regions, not just in isolated rural communities. The techniques that had been developed in agricultural and pastoral contexts proved adaptable to the more complex social and economic conditions that characterized important commercial and ecclesiastical centers. The documentation that these cases generated also made significant contributions to the development of demonological theory throughout Europe. The detailed confession records, legal proceedings, and administrative documents that resulted from Vaud prosecutions provided systematic information about alleged diabolic activities that could be analyzed and incorporated into increasingly sophisticated theoretical frameworks. This documentation helped to establish standardized European approaches to supernatural crime and provided precedents that influenced prosecutions in regions that were just beginning to experience large-scale witch hunting. The shores of Lake Geneva, where the beauty of the natural setting had once inspired poets and pilgrims, would be remembered for generations as the site of some of the most systematic and devastating supernatural persecutions in European history, proving that neither prosperity nor beauty could protect communities from the deadly dynamics of organized witch hunting. Neuchâtel and Jura ridges, mid-15th C. The forested ridges and hidden valleys of the Jura Mountains, stretching northwest from Lake Geneva toward the Rhine, represented some of the most remote and isolated territories in the Swiss Confederation. These were lands of deep forests and scattered clearings, where small communities had carved out precarious existences through a combination of agriculture, forestry, and the seasonal movement of livestock between valley floors and mountain pastures. The region of Neuchâtel, perched between these wild uplands and the more settled territories around the lake, served as a gateway between the civilized world and the mysterious forests that still harbored wolves, bears, and, according to local folklore, creatures far more dangerous than any natural predator. The isolation that characterized life in the Jura ridges created both vulnerabilities and opportunities for supernatural accusations that differed significantly from patterns that had developed in more settled regions. Communities were small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, which meant that unusual behavior or suspicious circumstances could quickly become the subject of collective speculation. But the same isolation also meant that outside authorities had limited ability to monitor local affairs, which gave communities more autonomy in deciding how to respond to supernatural accusations when they arose. The forest economy that dominated much of the region created distinctive patterns of social interaction and potential conflict that could easily be channeled into magical accusations. Woodcutting, charcoal production, and the gathering of forest products required extensive knowledge of woodland areas that could be interpreted as suspicious when things went wrong. The seasonal rhythms of forest work brought together laborers from different communities, creating opportunities for conflicts and misunderstandings that could escalate into supernatural accusations. And the dangerous nature of forest work, with its risks of accidents, injuries, and encounters with wild animals, created frequent occasions for seeking explanations that went beyond simple misfortune. The specific triggers for witch hunting in the Neuchâtel area reflected these distinctive regional characteristics. Rather than focusing primarily on agricultural disasters or livestock diseases, accusations in the forest regions centered heavily on alleged attacks against children and on disruptions of dairy production that were crucial to the survival of mountain communities. Suspected witches were accused of causing mysterious illnesses in infants and young children, of spoiling milk and cheese through supernatural means, and of summoning wild animals to attack livestock or threaten human settlements. The focus on threats to children was particularly pronounced in Jura witch trials, reflecting both the demographic realities of isolated mountain communities and the specific anxieties that characterized life in regions where medical assistance was scarce and child mortality rates were extremely high. In communities where the loss of a single child could threaten a family's economic survival, and where unexplained infant deaths were tragically common, supernatural explanations for childhood illnesses and deaths provided psychologically compelling alternatives to the more painful acknowledgement that many children died simply because of the harsh conditions of mountain life. The dairy-focused accusations that appeared in forest communities reflected the crucial importance of cattle raising and cheese production to mountain economies. Unlike the grain-focused agriculture that dominated lower elevation regions, mountain communities depended heavily on livestock products that required extensive specialized knowledge to produce successfully. The complex processes involved in cheese making, from the management of grazing animals to the fermentation and aging procedures that determined final quality, created numerous opportunities for things to go wrong in ways that could be attributed to supernatural interference. The geographical isolation of forest communities also created distinctive patterns in how supernatural accusations spread between different settlements. Unlike regions with well-developed road networks and regular market interactions, the Jura ridges were connected primarily by forest paths and seasonal migration routes that limited the speed and scope of communication between communities. This meant that witch hunting campaigns typically spread more slowly than had been characteristic in other regions, but also that they could persist longer in individual communities because of limited outside intervention. The investigative procedures that local authorities employed in forest witch trials were necessarily adapted to the practical constraints of mountain life and limited administrative resources. Unlike the sophisticated bureaucratic systems that had been developed in urban centers and prosperous agricultural regions, forest communities typically relied on simpler, procedural approaches that emphasized community participation and collective decision-making rather than professional legal expertise. This more informal approach to supernatural prosecution had both advantages and disadvantages for accused persons. On one hand, the community-based nature of investigations meant that local knowledge of individual personalities, family histories, and social relationships could provide some protection for people who were well integrated into their communities. On the other hand, the same intimate social relationships that could protect some individuals could make others extremely vulnerable if they had become isolated or marginalized within their communities. The confession narratives that emerged from Jura witch trials reflected both the distinctive cultural characteristics of forest communities and the broader demonological frameworks that were spreading throughout the regions where systematic witch hunting was occurring. Accused persons provided descriptions of diabolic activities that were adapted to forest environment, Sabbath gatherings in remote clearings, rituals involving forest animals and woodland spirits, magical practices that drew power from ancient trees and hidden springs. These forest-adapted supernatural narratives also incorporated elements that reflected the specific economic and social concerns of mountain communities. The alleged magical attacks often focused on disrupting the seasonal rhythms that were crucial to mountain survival, spoiling cheese during crucial production periods, causing livestock to become lost in forest areas, preventing the successful gathering of forest products that supplemented agricultural income. The gender patterns of accusations in forest communities showed some distinctive characteristics that reflected the specific roles that men and women played in mountain economies. While women continued to comprise the majority of those accused, the specific categories of women who were targeted often differed from patterns that had been typical in agricultural regions. Forest communities saw more accusations against women who were involved in seasonal activities, cheese making in mountain pastures, herb gathering in forest areas, the care of livestock during transhumance periods. The involvement of men in forest witch cases also followed patterns that were adapted to local economic and social conditions. Male suspects were often accused of specializing in forms of harmful magic that were particularly relevant to forest work and mountain life, causing accidents during woodcutting operations, summoning dangerous animals, creating supernatural hazards in forest areas that could threaten travelers or workers. The resistance that some forest communities offered to expanding supernatural prosecutions reflected the distinctive political and social structures that characterized these isolated regions. The limited presence of outside authorities meant that communities had more autonomy in deciding whether to pursue supernatural accusations, but also meant that they had fewer resources available for conducting sophisticated investigations or for protecting accused persons from community pressure. The documentation that forest witch trials generated was typically less extensive than had become common in more administrative, sophisticated regions, partly because of limited literacy, and partly because of the informal approaches that characterized forest legal procedures. This meant that detailed records of confession, narratives, investigative procedures, and legal reasoning were less likely to survive than had been typical in urban or agricultural witch hunts. Despite these limitations, the forest witch trials of the Jura Ridges made important contributions to the overall development of European supernatural persecution. They demonstrated that witch hunting could establish itself successfully in even the most isolated and resource-limited communities. They showed how demonological theories could be adapted to distinctive local conditions and concerns, and they provided evidence that the social and psychological dynamics that drove supernatural accusations were sufficiently flexible to operate effectively across a wide range of different environmental and cultural contexts. The deep forests and hidden valleys of the Jura Mountains, where communities had long struggled to maintain their precarious hold on civilization, had become another theater in the expanding European campaign against alleged diabolic conspiracy. The ancient woods that had sheltered these communities from outside interference could not protect them from the suspicions and fears that were spreading throughout the regions where systematic witch hunting had taken root. Savoyard territories, 1430s, 1460s. The Duchy of Savoy, stretching across the Alpine passes that connected France and Italy, occupied one of the most strategically crucial positions in medieval Europe. From the court at Chambéry, the Dukes of Savoy controlled the mountain routes that carried trade, armies, and ideas between the Mediterranean world and northern Europe. This strategic importance had made Savoy prosperous and politically significant, but it also meant that the duchy was constantly exposed to influences from multiple directions: legal innovations from France, demonological theories from Germany, investigative techniques from Italy, and the administrative practices that were spreading throughout the Swiss territories where systematic witch hunting had first emerged. By the 1430s, these converging influences were creating conditions that made Savoyard territories particularly susceptible to supernatural accusations and organized persecution. The duchy's complex political structure, with overlapping jurisdictions between ducal, episcopal, and local authorities, created multiple opportunities for different groups to pursue supernatural accusations when it served their interests. The prosperity that came from controlling Alpine trade routes meant that property confiscations could yield substantial returns, providing economic incentives for systematic prosecution. And the cultural diversity that characterized this border region meant that communities had access to supernatural beliefs and demonological theories from across Europe. The initial wave of witch hunting in Savoyard territories drew heavily on the techniques and theories that had been developed in neighboring Swiss regions, but adapted them to the distinctive political and social conditions that characterized ducal administration. Unlike the relatively simple governmental structures that had characterized earlier witch-hunting regions, Savoy had developed sophisticated bureaucratic systems that could be mobilized for systematic supernatural persecution. The duchy's legal professionals had extensive experience with complex criminal cases. Its administrative apparatus could handle the paperwork that large-scale prosecutions generated, and its financial systems could manage the property confiscations and redistribution that successful cases produced. The specific targets of Savoyard witch hunting reflected both the strategic importance of the region and the social tensions that characterized border territories, where different cultural and legal traditions intersected. Accusations often focused on individuals who were involved in trans-Alpine trade and communication innkeepers who served travelers from different regions, guides who knew the mountain passes, merchants who carried goods and information across political boundaries. These were people whose knowledge and connections made them valuable to their communities, but also potentially dangerous if they were suspected of using their expertise for supernatural purposes. The geographical scope of Savoyard witch hunting was more extensive than had been typical in earlier campaigns, partly because of the duchy's political complexity and partly because of the transportation networks that connected different regions. Cases that began in valley communities could quickly spread to urban centers, mountain villages, and border regions, as investigators followed confessional leads and tracked suspected networks of diabolic conspiracy. This geographical expansion was facilitated by the administrative systems that allowed different jurisdictions to coordinate their activities and share information about ongoing investigations. The theoretical sophistication that Savoyard authorities brought to supernatural prosecutions reflected the intellectual resources that were available in a region that had extensive contacts with European centers of learning. The duchy's legal professionals had access to the most advanced demonological literature of their time. Its ecclesiastical authorities were familiar with the latest developments in heresy prosecution, and its administrative personnel could draw on decades of experience with complex criminal investigations. This combination of intellectual and practical resources made Savoyard witch hunting particularly systematic and effective. The interrogation techniques that were employed in ducal territories incorporated innovations that had been developed across multiple regions of European witch hunting, creating synthesis approaches that were more sophisticated than had been available to earlier prosecutors. Accused persons were subjected to questioning procedures that had been refined through extensive experience, torture methods that had been proven effective for extracting supernatural confessions, and documentation systems that could record and analyze the intelligence that investigations produced. The confession narratives that emerged from Savoyard interrogations were among the most elaborate and detailed that had yet been produced in European witch trials. Accused persons provided extensive descriptions of diabolic organizations that allegedly operated throughout the Alpine regions, with membership lists that included participants from France, Italy, Switzerland, and the German territories. These confessions described recruitment networks that transcended political boundaries, transportation systems that allowed supernatural travel across vast distances, and coordination mechanisms that enabled diabolic conspiracies to operate on an international scale. The Sabbath gatherings that Savoyard confessions described reflected the duchy's position at the crossroads of European culture and politics. The alleged meeting sites included locations that were significant in multiple cultural traditions: ancient Roman ruins that dotted the landscape, medieval castles that controlled strategic passes, remote alpine valleys that could only be reached through dangerous mountain trails, The participants were described as representing the full diversity of Alpine society, from wealthy merchants and minor nobles to mountain peasants and urban craftsmen. The ritual activities that confessions detailed showed sophisticated understanding of the religious and cultural anxieties that characterized border regions where different traditions intersected. The alleged ceremonies combined elements from multiple supernatural traditions: Germanic folklore about wild hunts and forest spirits, Celtic beliefs about otherworldly gatherings, classical traditions about bacchanalian orgies, and Christian concerns about diabolic worship. This cultural synthesis created supernatural narratives that were particularly compelling to communities that were already dealing with the challenges of living at the intersection of different civilizations. The expansion of investigations from individual cases to systematic campaigns proceeded with remarkable efficiency in Savoyard territories, partly because of the administrative sophistication that ducal authorities could bring to these proceedings. The bureaucratic systems for managing complex prosecutions were already in place. The legal expertise necessary for sophisticated supernatural trials was readily available, and the financial mechanisms for funding extended investigations had been developed through experience with other forms of criminal prosecution. The coordination between secular and ecclesiastical authorities that characterized Savoyard witch hunting was particularly effective, reflecting the duchy's experience with managing complex political relationships and overlapping jurisdictions. Ducal officials and church authorities had developed working relationships that allowed them to share information, coordinate investigations, and divide responsibilities in ways that maximized the effectiveness of supernatural prosecutions while minimizing jurisdictional conflicts. The economic dimensions of Savoyard witch hunting were also more sophisticated than had been typical in earlier campaigns. The duchy's financial administrators had extensive experience with property confiscation and redistribution, which meant that the economic benefits of successful prosecutions could be systematically maximized. The wealth that was available in this prosperous border region meant that individual cases could yield substantial returns, while the administrative systems that were in place meant that these returns could be efficiently processed and reinvested in continued investigations. The international implications of Savoyard witch hunting were particularly significant because of the duchy's strategic position and extensive diplomatic contacts. News of supernatural prosecutions spread rapidly to other European courts. Legal innovations that were developed in ducal territories were quickly adopted elsewhere, and the theoretical frameworks that emerged from Savoyard investigations influenced demonological thinking throughout the regions where systematic witch hunting was spreading. The resistance that some communities and individuals offered to expanding supernatural prosecutions took forms that reflected the specific political and social structures of the duchy. The complexity of Savoyard governmental systems created more opportunities for appeals and legal challenges than had been available in simpler jurisdictions. The cultural diversity of the region meant that some communities could draw on alternative legal and religious traditions to challenge the assumptions that underlay supernatural prosecutions. And the duchy's diplomatic connections provided some accused persons with opportunities to seek protection from outside authorities. These resistance efforts achieved mixed results, sometimes succeeding in protecting individual accused persons or limiting the scope of particular investigations, but generally failing to halt the overall momentum of supernatural persecution. The institutional mechanisms that supported witch hunting had become sufficiently sophisticated and well established to overcome most forms of opposition, and the theoretical frameworks that justified these prosecutions had developed responses to most of the challenges that critics could raise. The documentation that Savoyard witch trials generated made crucial contributions to the development of demonological theory and legal practice throughout Europe. The detailed records of confessions, investigations, and legal proceedings that were produced in ducal territories provided systematic information about alleged diabolic activities that could be analyzed and incorporated into increasingly sophisticated theoretical frameworks. This documentation helped to establish standardized European approaches to supernatural crime and provided precedents that influenced prosecutions in regions that were just beginning to experience large-scale witch hunting. The legacy of Savoyard supernatural persecution extended far beyond the immediate region where it occurred. The techniques that had been developed in ducal territories were studied and adapted by prosecutors throughout Europe. The theoretical innovations that emerged from Savoyard investigations influenced academic and legal thinking about supernatural crime for generations. And the administrative models that had been created for managing systematic witch hunting provided templates that could be applied wherever appropriate political and social conditions existed. The mountain passes that had made Savoy prosperous had also made it a conduit for the spread of supernatural persecution throughout Europe. The same strategic position that had brought the duchy wealth and political importance had also made it a crucial transmission point for the techniques, theories, and institutional mechanisms that were transforming isolated magical accusations into systematic campaigns of persecution. The Alpine valleys that had once echoed with the sounds of international commerce now resonated with the screams of accused witches, as the duchy's strategic advantages were turned to the service of diabolic conspiracy theories and systematic supernatural persecution. The courts at Chambéry, which had once hosted diplomatic negotiations and international trade agreements, became centers for the coordination of witch-hunting campaigns that would influence European legal and religious culture for centuries to come. The prosperity that had made Savoy an attractive target for supernatural accusations had also provided the resources necessary for conducting persecution on an unprecedented scale, creating a deadly combination of motive and means that would be replicated throughout the regions where systematic witch hunting took root.